There would come a day when Nebuchadnezzar could no longer command his own mind. The man who issued orders across an empire would be driven away from human society, unable even to govern himself. But that collapse is startling only because of the height from which he fell. His story begins when he was young, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective, a crown prince leading Babylon's army toward the battle that would make him master of the ancient Near East. In 605 BC, the political future of Judah was being decided hundreds of miles to the north, beside the Euphrates River. The place was Carchemish, a fortified city controlling one of the major crossings between Mesopotamia and the lands of Syria and Palestine. Egypt had moved troops into the region to preserve its influence there. Babylon had come to remove them. The struggle between those powers had already changed life in Jerusalem. A few years earlier, Pharaoh Necho had killed King Josiah of Judah at Megiddo. He removed Josiah's son Jehoahaz after a reign of only 3 months, carried him to Egypt, imposed tribute on Judah, and placed another son of Josiah on the throne. That king was Jehoiachin. His crown depended on Egyptian authority, and his kingdom stood inside the territory Egypt was attempting to hold. Babylon was rising under Nabopolassar, who had broken his kingdom free from Assyrian rule and helped destroy the Assyrian imperial centers. By 605, he was old and no longer leading the decisive campaign himself. Command belonged to his son, Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah describes what followed as a catastrophe for Egypt. Its army prepared with shields, horses, helmets, spears, and armor. The language swells with the appearance of military confidence, then suddenly reverses. The soldiers are terrified. The mighty men do not hold their ground. They flee, but escape closes around them. Egypt had come north expecting to exercise power. At Carchemish, its forces were broken. The surviving Babylonian record agrees on the essential outcome. Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptian army at Carchemish, pursued the fugitives southward, and struck them again in the region of Hamath. Egyptian control in Syria and the Levant collapsed with extraordinary speed. Cities and smaller kingdoms that had lived under Egyptian pressure now faced the army of Babylon. This victory did more than win a battlefield. It cleared the route toward Judah. To understand the danger, it helps to picture the geography Nebuchadnezzar was mastering. An army traveling from Babylon could not simply march west across the harshest stretch of desert. It normally moved northwest along the Euphrates, then turned south through Syria toward the coastal plain and the hill country of Judah. Carchemish stood near the hinge of that route. Once Egypt's army had been driven away, the kingdoms to the south were exposed one after another. Nebuchadnezzar advanced rapidly. Jeremiah's account follows the defeated Egyptian force in the direction of its own land, while the Babylonian chronicle says the conqueror brought the region under his control and pressed toward the Egyptian frontier. The prince was not raiding and withdrawing. He was transferring an entire zone of allegiance from one great power to another. Then, while the campaign was still active, news arrived from Babylon. Nabopolassar had died. For Nebuchadnezzar, this created a danger that had nothing to do with Egyptian resistance. He had the victorious army, but he did not yet securely possess the throne. Succession in an ancient royal house could be a vulnerable moment. Distance made it worse. Babylon lay far to the east, and a rival or palace faction could exploit the time required for the crown prince to return. The Babylonian Chronicle records the transition with remarkable economy. Nebuchadnezzar hurried back to Babylon, reached the capital, and took the throne. The speed of that journey later attracted imaginative retellings, but the secure point is simple. He left the Western theater, returned promptly after his father's death, and was acknowledged as king. Within a matter of months, the commander who had shattered Egypt became ruler of Babylon. He had inherited more than a city, Babylon stood at the center of a renewed Mesopotamian empire with immense ambitions and equally immense demands. Victory had to be converted into tribute, loyalty, garrisons, administrative control, and dependable local kings. A conquered region did not remain conquered merely because one army had lost a battle. Nebuchadnezzar would have to return west, receive submission, punish resistance, and make the imperial order durable. Judah's king now had to reckon with that order. Jehoiachin had been installed by Egypt and had paid heavily for Egyptian support. Carchemish removed the power behind his throne without removing him. The king remained in Jerusalem, but the political ground beneath him had shifted. The Book of Kings compresses the change into a stark statement. Nebuchadnezzar came up, and Jehoiachin became his servant. That word described a political relationship, not domestic service. Jehoiachin retained his throne, court, and local authority, but he now ruled as a subordinate of Babylon. Tribute and obedience were expected. His value to Nebuchadnezzar depended on his ability to keep Judah quiet, deliver its wealth, and avoid inviting Egypt back into the contest. Daniel presents the beginning of Babylonian pressure on Jerusalem through a closer, more personal lens. In the third year of Jehoiakim's reign, it says, Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Jeremiah dates the Battle of Carchemish to Jehoiakim's fourth year. The difference need not be hidden. Ancient kingdoms did not all count a ruler's years in the same way, and Daniel and Jeremiah are also looking at the period from different narrative positions. Jeremiah fixes the Egyptian defeat within Judah's public crisis. Daniel opens with Jerusalem already caught in Nebuchadnezzar's hand. The sources do not give a long description of this first encounter at Jerusalem. There is no detailed assault scene, no account of Babylonian troops storming the walls, and no report that the city was destroyed at this stage. Jehoiakim continued to reign. What emerges is subjection. Babylon reached Jerusalem, its king yielded, and the conqueror took selected prizes that advertised who now held power. Among those prizes were vessels from the temple of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried at least some of them to the land of Shinar and placed them in the treasury of his god. The act was practical because precious objects were wealth, but it was also a statement. Royal victories in the ancient world were understood in religious as well as political terms. A conqueror who removed sacred objects from a defeated people's sanctuary could display them as evidence that his gods had granted him victory. Daniel's telling quietly challenges that interpretation from the first sentence of the action. Nebuchadnezzar came, besieged, and took. But Daniel says the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand, together with part of the temple vessels. Babylon's king appears as the active conqueror, yet the text refuses to treat his success as proof that he stands above the God worshipped in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar does not understand that distinction. For now, everything visible supports his confidence. The temple still stood. Worship continued. Jerusalem remained populated, and a son of David still occupied its throne. Yet something irreversible had begun. Objects associated with Judah's worship now rested in a Babylonian treasury. The road between Jerusalem and Babylon had become a road of removal. Nebuchadnezzar also ordered that young men be selected from the royal family and the nobility of Judah. They were to be physically sound, impressive in appearance, capable of learning, well-informed, and suited for service in the king's palace. The instruction reveals the careful intelligence behind Babylonian conquest. Nebuchadnezzar did not think only in terms of destroyed armies and collected tribute. He took human ability. These captives were probably adolescents or young men, although the text does not specify their exact ages. They came from the educated and privileged levels of Judean society. Some may have been connected to the royal house itself. Removed from Jerusalem, they could no longer strengthen a potentially rebellious local court. Trained in Babylon, they might instead become useful servants of the empire. This was conquest applied to identity. The palace would teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Their days would be regulated by royal provision. Their advancement would depend on succeeding inside a foreign court. Everything around them would communicate that their future came from Nebuchadnezzar. The journey itself receives almost no narrative detail. Scripture does not describe their farewells, their emotions, the weather along the route, or the appearance of Babylon when they first saw it. Those blank spaces should remain blank. What is established is difficult enough. They were separated from their homeland and brought into the institutional center of the kingdom that had subdued it. Among them were 4 Judeans, whose names the story preserves: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their Hebrew names belonged to the world from which they had been taken, a world shaped by the worship of Israel's God. In Babylon, the chief court official gave them new names: Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The precise linguistic explanation of every Babylonian form is debated, but their purpose within the story is clear. The empire was beginning to assign these young men a new public identity. Nebuchadnezzar's program was generous by imperial standards and total in its reach. The captives were not thrown into a labor gang. They were offered elite education, food from the royal establishment, and a possible place before the king. But privilege could serve control as effectively as chains. The palace would determine what they studied, what they were called, what they ate, and the kind of service for which they were being prepared. This arrangement also served the king's larger project. An expanding empire required administrators who could work across languages and cultures. Local elites, once retrained, could help translate imperial decisions into the realities of subject peoples. Their presence at court could also assure other conquered families that advancement remained possible through loyalty. Nebuchadnezzar was building a system in which the best talent of defeated nations would increase Babylon's strength. From his position, the design was sensible. He had defeated Egypt, secured the succession, brought Judah under his authority, removed sacred wealth, and gathered promising captives for royal service. Every development confirmed that power was moving toward him. He could enter a kingdom, leave its ruler in place, take what he valued, and begin reshaping the next generation. But the 4 Judeans carried something his officials could not catalogue with the temple vessels. They arrived without political power, military leverage, or any visible means of returning home. They would learn Babylon's language and operate inside its court. Yet the first decision awaiting them concerned a boundary Nebuchadnezzar had no reason to notice. The king had conquered their city. He was about to discover that he had not conquered their allegiance. The first boundary appeared at the king's table. Nebuchadnezzar had assigned the trainees a daily portion of his own food and wine. For young captives being prepared for court, this was a mark of inclusion and investment. They were to receive provisions from the royal household throughout their 3 years of education, after which they would be brought before the king. Babylon intended to feed them while teaching them, then judge whether the investment had produced useful servants. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal provisions. The text states his decision firmly, but does not identify one simple reason for it. Some of the food may have conflicted with Israel's dietary laws. It may have been connected with Babylonian religious practice, or its preparation may have made faithfulness impossible to verify. Wine itself was not generally forbidden to Israelites, and the 4 young men did not reject every benefit that came through the palace. What mattered here was that Daniel recognized a line he could not cross. He did not announce a protest in the dining quarters or accuse the official responsible for him. He approached Ashpenaz, the chief palace official, and asked for permission not to defile himself. That request carried more danger than its respectful form might suggest. The provisions came from the king. Refusing them could be interpreted as rejecting royal favor, resisting the training program, or criticizing what Nebuchadnezzar himself consumed. Daniel had no standing from which to demand an exception. He belonged to a conquered people and occupied his place in Babylon because the king had selected him for a purpose. Yet Daniel says that God gave him favor and compassion in the sight of the chief official. Ashpenaz listened rather than punishing him. The answer, however, was not consent. "I fear my lord the king," he told Daniel. His fear was practical and well-founded. Nebuchadnezzar had personally determined what the trainees would eat and drink. If Daniel and his companions began to look weak or unhealthy compared with the other young men of their age, the chief official would be held responsible. He put the consequence bluntly. Daniel could make him forfeit his head to the king. The official's response reveals how closely royal generosity could stand beside royal danger. The same ruler who supplied the young men's food could kill the servant who failed to produce the expected result. Ashpenaz might sympathize with Daniel, but sympathy did not cancel his accountability. He had bodies to present, standards to meet, and a king whose displeasure he could not afford. Daniel did not press him into an open act of defiance. Instead, he approached the guard or steward whom Ashpenaz had placed directly over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He proposed a limited test. "Test your servants for 10 days, he said. During that period, the four would be given food grown from seed, often translated as vegetables or pulse, and water to drink. At the end, the steward could inspect their appearance beside that of the young men eating the royal provisions. He would then act according to what he saw. The proposal reduced the official's immediate risk. Daniel was not asking him to approve a permanent arrangement without evidence. 10 days created a short, observable interval, and the steward would retain the right to judge the outcome. If the four deteriorated, the experiment could be stopped before the final royal examination. Daniel also included his companions in the request. The decision was personal in the sense that he had resolved it within himself, but he would not face the test alone. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah accepted the same restriction. All four would be examined together, and failure by any of them could expose the arrangement. The steward agreed. For 10 days, the other trainees continued receiving their assigned food and wine, while the 4 Judeans received the simpler provisions they had requested. Daniel does not describe those days individually. There is no record of conversations at the meals, hostile reactions from the other students, or gradual changes in appearance. The story moves directly to the inspection because that was the condition on which everything depended. At the end of the 10 days, the 4 looked better and healthier than all the young men who had eaten the king's food. The wording emphasizes what the steward could see. The result was sufficient for him to continue the arrangement. He took away the provisions and wine assigned to them and gave them the food they had requested. That decision changed daily life for the remainder of their preparation. An exception that had seemed dangerous became workable because the young men did not suffer the visible harm the official feared. Their loyalty to God remained largely hidden within the routine of the training program, but it now had an established place inside it. The test did not give Daniel control over the rest of his environment. He still answered to Babylonian officials. He still carried the name Belteshazzar in court. He still studied materials selected for service to Nebuchadnezzar. The food was one defined issue, not an escape from captivity. Their education continued. The language and literature of the Chaldeans represented a demanding intellectual world. Babylon's scholarly traditions had developed over centuries and were preserved on clay tablets written in cuneiform script. Court specialists worked with royal records, traditional texts, mathematics, medicine, observations of the heavens, omen collections, prayers, rituals, and the accumulated writings used to advise kings. Learning to operate in that environment required far more than conversational fluency. The term Chaldeans can refer broadly to Babylonians, but in Daniel, it also becomes associated with a class of learned court advisors. These were men expected to interpret signs, preserve inherited knowledge, and respond when a ruler faced something he did not understand. Their expertise belonged to the machinery of kingship. A monarch who commanded armies still needed specialists to read, calculate, remember, interpret, and warn. Daniel and his companions were trained in that world without being absorbed by every belief within it. The story does not treat learning a foreign language as betrayal, nor does it suggest that knowledge becomes unclean simply because Babylon teaches it. The young men could master the empire's literature while recognizing that its explanations of reality were not final. Their situation demanded close judgment. Some commands could be obeyed, some benefits could be received, some forms of education could be mastered, other demands would touch an allegiance that belonged elsewhere. Daniel did not solve that problem once for his entire life. He would meet it repeatedly, each time under different pressure. For these four young men, ability became another area in which the Babylonian plan produced an unexpected result. God gave them knowledge and skill in every kind of literature and wisdom required of them. Daniel received an additional capacity, understanding in visions and dreams. That distinction did not yet bring him before the king as an interpreter. No dream had been presented, and Daniel had made no claim in public. The ability was simply named before the crisis that would require it. In a court filled with experts trained to explain signs and mysteries, one Judean captive possessed a gift that had not come from Babylon's curriculum. The 3 years moved toward a fixed appointment. The palace could provide instruction, but the king himself would decide who was fit to remain near him. Nebuchadnezzar was not a ceremonial examiner, lending his presence to a decision already made by subordinates. Daniel portrays him personally, questioning the trainees. Their future depended on how they answered. When the appointed period ended, Ashpenaz brought the young men into the royal presence. This was the point at which the chief official's responsibility would be tested. He had been commanded to select candidates with intelligence and aptitude, oversee their formation, and prepare them to serve in the palace. The 4 Judeans had received an unapproved alteration to their assigned diet, even if the direct steward had managed it. Now their appearance and ability would be exposed to the judgment Ashpenaz had feared from the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar spoke with the trainees. The text does not preserve his individual questions, so there is no basis for recreating an examination dialogue. What it gives is the king's conclusion. Among all those presented, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The 4 captives therefore entered the king's service. Their advancement was striking because it occurred through the very process designed to make them useful to Babylon. They had not avoided the examination or sought a protected existence among their own people. They stood before the conqueror of their homeland, answered him in the knowledge expected at his court, and surpassed the other candidates. Nebuchadnezzar continued to test them after their initial appointment. Whenever he questioned them about matters requiring wisdom and understanding, he found them 10 times better than the magicians and enchanters throughout his kingdom. 10 times expresses overwhelming superiority rather than the result of a numerical scoring system. The king had access to a large body of established advisors. Some titles translated as magicians or enchanters referred to recognized scholarly and religious specialists, not performers entertaining the court. They were guardians of techniques Babylon trusted when ordinary knowledge failed. Yet the 4 newcomers repeatedly gave the king better answers. This did not make Nebuchadnezzar a worshipper of their god, and it did not make the court safe. From his perspective, their excellence confirmed the success of his selection program. He had taken promising youths from a subject nation, educated them, and placed their abilities at his disposal. He could value what they knew without yet understanding the source Daniel's account gives for their wisdom. For Daniel and his companions, success created its own exposure. Obscurity might have kept them away from the king's most dangerous demands. Excellence brought them closer. They were now attached to a ruler accustomed to immediate obedience and decisive results. Daniel's special understanding of dreams also placed him near a particularly sensitive part of royal life. Dreams in the ancient court could be treated as warnings, disclosures, or signs bearing on a king and his realm. A disturbing dream was not always dismissed as a private experience. It could raise questions about war, rebellion, divine anger, illness, succession, or the stability of the throne. That was why kings maintained specialists capable of interpretation. The ruler might command the visible apparatus of state, but a dream confronted him with knowledge he did not possess. He needed advisors who could make the hidden meaning accessible and, when necessary, prescribe a response. Nebuchadnezzar had such advisors in abundance. The empire had inherited generations of technical learning for exactly this purpose. Daniel and his three companions now belonged to the broader company of wise men responsible for answering royal questions, although their convictions and source of wisdom distinguished them from it. The chapter that introduces them looks far beyond their examination and says Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. That statement reaches across decades, still waiting to be lived. Kings would rise, cities would fall, and Babylon itself would eventually pass to another empire, yet the captive brought from Jerusalem would remain. At this early moment, however, Cyrus was nowhere in view. Nebuchadnezzar's reign had only begun. His victories were fresh, his authority was expanding, and the four Judeans had just taken their places within his administration. The arrangement appeared advantageous to everyone. Ashpenaz had delivered exceptional candidates. The steward's quiet accommodation had produced no visible failure. The four young men had preserved the boundary they believed faithfulness required. Nebuchadnezzar had gained servants whose wisdom exceeded that of his established experts. Then the king went to sleep and encountered something none of those experts could control. It disturbed him so deeply that sleep deserted him. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar summoned the specialists responsible for dealing with such experiences: magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and Chaldean advisors. These were distinct groups within the learned and religious establishment of the court, though Daniel gathers them under the broader category of wise men. They came and stood before the king, expecting to hear the dream and apply their disciplines to its interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar told them that his spirit was troubled because he wanted to understand what he had dreamed. The Chaldeans answered in Aramaic, the language in which the book continues for the next several chapters. Their request was conventional and reasonable. "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation." Nebuchadnezzar refused. His reply can be translated in ways that leave some uncertainty about whether the dream had escaped him or whether he was deliberately withholding it. His demand, however, is unmistakable. The advisors had to tell him the dream itself and then explain its meaning. If they failed, they would be cut in pieces and their houses reduced to ruins. If they succeeded, they would receive gifts, rewards, and great honor. The king had turned interpretation into a test that could not be manipulated. Once he supplied the dream, a skilled advisor might construct an explanation broad enough to sound persuasive. Nebuchadnezzar wanted proof that the same hidden knowledge giving access to the meaning could also recover the dream. The reward promised royal generosity. The penalty revealed what happened when the king suspected that his servants were wasting his time. The advisors tried again. Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar heard repetition as delay. He accused them of trying to gain time because they understood that his decision was fixed. Unless they told him the dream, they faced one sentence. He believed they had agreed to speak false and corrupt words until circumstances changed. Only by revealing the dream could they demonstrate that their interpretation deserved trust. The Chaldeans finally stated the limit of their profession. No one on earth could do what the king required. No great and powerful ruler, they argued, had ever demanded such a thing from a magician, enchanter, or Chaldean. The request was too difficult. No one could reveal it except the gods, and the gods did not dwell with mortal flesh. They had identified the exact problem, though not its solution. Nebuchadnezzar possessed the authority to demand hidden knowledge, but his entire learned establishment remained human. Their methods began with information the king would not provide. Faced with a mystery known only beyond the human realm, they could go no further. The king became furious. He ordered the destruction of all the wise men of Babylon. The sentence did not remain confined to the advisors who had stood before him. It extended to the entire class, including men who had not been present when the demand was made. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were now counted among that body. Their exceptional performance in the royal examination had brought them into a profession marked for death. Officials went out to carry out the decree, and they looked for Daniel and his companions. Daniel responded with prudence and discretion when Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, came to kill the wise men. He did not resist, hide, or pretend ignorance. He asked why the king's decree was so urgent. Arioch explained what had happened. Daniel then went to Nebuchadnezzar and requested time so that he could give the king the interpretation. The earlier advisors had been accused of seeking time because they offered no path to an answer. Daniel asked for it with a commitment. The mystery would be disclosed. He returned to his house and told Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The four who had shared the test over the royal provisions now faced a common death sentence. Daniel urged them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning the mystery so that they would not be destroyed with the rest of Babylon's wise men. Their prayer was not presented as an exercise in superior technique. They needed mercy. If God did not reveal what the king had concealed, Daniel had no more natural access to it than the advisors who had admitted their inability. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Before returning to the palace, Daniel blessed the God of heaven. His words begin with God's name rather than with his own rescue. Wisdom and might belong to God. He changes times and seasons, removes kings and establishes kings, gives wisdom to the wise, and reveals deep and hidden things. Darkness does not conceal what he chooses to make known. The praise matched the content Daniel was about to deliver. Nebuchadnezzar assumed that kingship gave him the power to set impossible conditions for others. The vision showed Daniel a rule capable of setting up and removing kings themselves. Daniel thanked the God of his fathers for giving him wisdom and strength, and for making known what the four had requested. The answer had come to Daniel, but he treated the revelation as the response to their shared appeal. He went immediately to Arioch. "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon," Daniel told him. "Bring me before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation." Daniel's first recorded use of the revelation was to stop the execution. The order threatened many advisors who did not share his faith and whose methods had failed completely, yet he did not preserve the answer until after their deaths. Their inability had created the opening for his appearance, but their destruction was not required for his vindication. Arioch hurried Daniel into the royal presence and announced that he had found a man among the exiles from Judah who could make the interpretation known. The phrasing placed the discovery in Arioch's hands. Nebuchadnezzar's question went directly to the captive known at court as Belteshazzar. Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel could have answered with a simple yes. Instead, he first separated the revelation from his own professional status. No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or diviners could show the king the mystery he had asked. The Chaldeans had been right about human inability, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Daniel said this God had made known to Nebuchadnezzar what would happen in the latter days. He also denied that the secret had been revealed because he possessed wisdom greater than anyone else alive. It was given so that the interpretation could be made known to the king, and so that Nebuchadnezzar might understand the thoughts of his own mind. Then Daniel told him what he had seen. In the dream, Nebuchadnezzar was looking at an enormous statue. It stood before him, dazzling in brightness and terrifying in appearance. Its head was made of fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron, while its feet were a mixture of iron and clay. The materials descended in value from gold, but they also changed in strength. The image combined splendor with instability. The iron legs looked capable of crushing whatever stood beneath them, yet the entire figure rested on feet containing substances that would not truly hold together. As the king watched, a stone was cut out without human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and shattered them. The collapse moved upward. Iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold broke apart together. They became like chaff on a summer threshing floor, light enough for the wind to carry away without leaving a trace. The stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Daniel had done what the court advisors declared impossible. He had described the dream before offering a single line of interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar could now test the truth of Daniel's claim against the private experience that had disturbed his sleep. This was the dream, Daniel said. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. He addressed Nebuchadnezzar as King of Kings and said that the God of heaven had given him kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Wherever human beings lived, God had placed them, along with the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens, into his hand and had made him ruler over them. You are the head of gold. For a king who had recently inherited Babylon and won control of the western territories, the identification confirmed the grandeur of his position. Daniel did not minimize the reach of Nebuchadnezzar's authority, but he located its source outside the king. Nebuchadnezzar held dominion because it had been given. The golden head was also only one part of the statue. After Nebuchadnezzar would arise another kingdom, inferior to his, followed by a third kingdom of bronze that would rule over the earth. A fourth would be strong as iron. Just as iron crushes and shatters, this kingdom would break and crush the others. Its final form would be divided. The feet and toes, made partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, represented a kingdom containing some of iron's strength while remaining brittle. Its parts would attempt to combine, but they would not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Daniel did not name these later kingdoms in the interpretation he gave Nebuchadnezzar. The immediate point required no list of future rulers. Babylon's empire, however magnificent, would not be permanent. Other powers would follow it, each appearing dominant in its own time. The whole sequence remained one fragile image awaiting the blow that ended it. In the days of those kings, Daniel said, the God of heaven would establish a kingdom that would never be destroyed or left to another people. It would break all the other kingdoms and bring them to an end, while it would endure forever. That was the stone cut from the mountain without human hands. Its origin did not lie in an army, succession struggle, or human dynasty. The great God had shown the king what would take place. Daniel concluded without qualification. The dream was certain, and its interpretation trustworthy. Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face before Daniel. He ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him, gestures of extraordinary honor from a reigning monarch toward a foreign captive. Daniel does not say that the king now understood every implication of the dream or redirected his worship exclusively to Israel's God. His spoken response was nevertheless explicit. Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. The ruler who had threatened an entire scholarly class now acknowledged a source of knowledge beyond his court. He had asked for evidence, and he had received it in the form he demanded. Nebuchadnezzar rewarded Daniel richly and gave him many great gifts. He made him ruler over the province of Babylon and chief prefect over all its wise men. The death sentence had become promotion, and the Judean marked for execution now held authority within the establishment whose lives he had asked Arioch to spare. Daniel did not leave his companions behind. At his request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, while Daniel remained at the royal court. Nebuchadnezzar now knew that his empire was the golden head, and that its glory had been given by the God who revealed what no Babylonian specialist could discover. He also knew that the image did not end with him. His kingdom would be followed, replaced, and ultimately swept away. The revelation changed the standing of the four captives and widened the king's knowledge. But it had not yet changed his instinct to make visible unity answer to royal command. The next great image in Babylon would not arrive in a dream. Nebuchadnezzar would build it himself. The image was made of gold. Daniel gives no year for its construction and does not say that Nebuchadnezzar built it because of the dream. The connection belongs to the order of the narrative. First, the king was shown an image whose golden head represented his temporary kingdom. Now he erected a golden image and required the governing class of his realm to bow before it. It stood on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Its height was 60 cubits and its width 6, approximately 90 feet high and 9 feet wide by a common reckoning. Those narrow proportions have led to suggestions that the figure stood on a tall pedestal or that the word described something more like a column. But the account does not supply its shape. What mattered to everyone summoned there was its scale, its royal sponsorship, and the command attached to it. Nebuchadnezzar sent orders to assemble the satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and other provincial officials for the image's dedication. The list reaches through the layers of imperial administration. These were people who exercised the king's authority at different levels and in different regions. Their presence turned the ceremony into a public display of government gathered around an object the king had established. The officials came. Among them were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, serving in the province of Babylon through the promotion Nebuchadnezzar had granted at Daniel's request. Daniel is not mentioned in this episode, and the text offers no explanation for his absence. The three men stood without him in a field, crowded with people whose positions depended on royal approval. A herald announced the order in a loud voice. The command addressed peoples, nations, and languages, the human diversity contained within Babylon's rule. When they heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, and the rest of the musical instruments, everyone was to fall down and worship the golden image. The required action was immediate and visible. No official could comply privately or postpone a decision until the ceremony ended. Music would provide a single signal, and the entire assembly was expected to move together. The penalty was equally public. Whoever did not fall down and worship would immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Large furnaces were used in ancient Mesopotamia for industrial work, including the firing of bricks. The text does not describe this furnace's construction, and there is no need to imagine machinery beyond what the scene gives. It was close enough to serve as an immediate instrument of execution, and its purpose in the command was plain. The king was not inviting theological agreement. He was requiring an act and threatening the body of anyone who withheld it. The instruments sounded. The assembled peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the image Nebuchadnezzar had set up. From a distance, the ceremony may have appeared completely successful. The administrators of a varied empire had heard one command and given one response. The image stood above them, the royal decree had been obeyed, and no disorder interrupted the dedication. But 3 officials remained standing. Their refusal became known because certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They began with the formal greeting, "O King, live forever," then reminded Nebuchadnezzar of his own decree. Anyone who heard the music and refused to worship was to be cast into the furnace. The king confirmed the command simply by listening as they repeated it. Then the accusers named the men. "There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Their wording made the accusation personal. These were not unknown foreigners at the edge of the crowd. Nebuchadnezzar had elevated them. They held office because he had rewarded Daniel and accepted his request. The accusers portrayed their refusal as ingratitude toward the ruler who had given them authority. They charged the 3 men on 3 connected grounds. They paid no attention to the king, they did not serve his gods, and they would not worship the golden image he had erected. The ceremony had compressed political obedience and religious submission into one required movement. By remaining upright, the 3 had become visible dissenters in both senses. Nebuchadnezzar reacted with rage and fury. He ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego brought before him. They were taken from the assembly and made to stand in the presence of the king who had once promoted them. Their record of service did not settle the matter. Neither did the wisdom for which they and Daniel had been honored. Nebuchadnezzar addressed the single act that had challenged his command. "Is it true," he asked, "that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up?" He offered them another opportunity. The instruments would sound again. If they were ready to fall down and worship, the crisis could end. The sentence remains unfinished in the king's speech, as if compliance required no further discussion. But if they refused, they would be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar asked the question that exposed how far he had moved from his confession before Daniel. "Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" He had already called Daniel's God the God of gods, Lord of kings, and revealer of mysteries. That acknowledgment had followed a revelation Nebuchadnezzar could not deny. Here, with his authority openly resisted, he spoke as though his sentence closed every possible appeal. A god might reveal what the king did not know. Nebuchadnezzar was less prepared to accept that a god could overturn what the king had decided. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered him together. They did not ask for another 10-day test, more time, or a private accommodation. The food assigned during their training had allowed a limited proposal because the responsible official could evaluate the result without openly defying the king. Worship allowed no substitute. The signal, movement, and meaning had already been defined. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." Their words were not an attempt to insult him. They meant that the decision did not require negotiation. The king could repeat the music and the threat, but he could not change their answer. "If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the blazing furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." Then they added the words that removed any suggestion that obedience depended on rescue. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. They affirmed God's ability without claiming knowledge of what he would choose to do. If deliverance came, they would remain faithful. If the fire killed them, they would remain faithful. Nebuchadnezzar could determine whether they lived under his administration, but he could not make their worship follow his command. The king's expression changed toward them. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, language expressing the extremity of his rage rather than a measured temperature. Greater heat was unnecessary for execution. It served the impulse to intensify punishment against men who had answered his second chance with a settled refusal. Nebuchadnezzar commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to bind the 3 and throw them into the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tied while still wearing their trousers, tunics, hats, and other garments. No time was allowed to strip them or prepare them for death. The king's order was urgent, and the furnace had been made exceedingly hot. The soldiers carried them toward the opening. As they cast the bound men in, the flames surged out and killed the soldiers, executing the sentence. The king's attempt to make the punishment overwhelming first consumed his own servants. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell bound into the blazing furnace. Nebuchadnezzar was watching. Suddenly he rose in astonishment and asked his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered, "Certainly, O king." He told them what he could see. "I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. The 4th," he said, "had the appearance of a son of the gods or a divine being." Later, Nebuchadnezzar described this figure as an angel sent by the God of the 3 men. The account does not identify him more precisely. What the king knew in that moment was that his arithmetic had failed. 3 bound victims had become 4 unharmed figures moving freely inside the place of execution. The ropes were gone. The men were alive. The fire into which Nebuchadnezzar had thrown them had released them from the only thing that restrained them. The king approached the door of the furnace as closely as he could and called out, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." Minutes earlier, he had asked what God could deliver them from his hands. Now, he used their God's supremacy as the basis for summoning them from a sentence he could not enforce. The 3 men came out of the fire. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal counselors gathered around them. The same officials whose collective worship had made the dedication appear complete now became witnesses to its reversal. They examined the men at close range. The fire had no power over their bodies. The hair of their heads was not singed. Their garments were not damaged. There was not even the smell of fire on them. The evidence answered every part of the execution. Nebuchadnezzar had bound them, but they walked freely. He had chosen his strongest soldiers, but those men died while the prisoners lived. He had intensified the flames, but the added heat left no mark on its intended victims. He had demanded a visible act of worship, and instead the entire governing assembly saw a visible deliverance. Nebuchadnezzar blessed the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He said their God had sent his angel and rescued his servants because they trusted in him. He also described their refusal accurately. They had set aside the king's command and yielded their bodies rather than serve or worship any god except their own. The king's praise recognized the very allegiance he had attempted to break. Yet his response still took the form he knew best, a decree backed by mutilation and destruction. Nebuchadnezzar announced that any person from any people, nation, or language who spoke against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be cut in pieces and have his house reduced to ruins. The threat echoed the sentence he had issued against the wise men when they could not reveal his dream. His conclusion was sound within the event. No other god could rescue in this way. But he protected that conclusion by coercion, as though the god who had just defeated royal violence required Nebuchadnezzar to threaten violence on his behalf. The king then promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Their accusers had emphasized that Nebuchadnezzar appointed them. The outcome confirmed and strengthened that appointment. Refusal had brought them to the furnace, and deliverance returned them to public office with the imperial administration as witnesses. Nebuchadnezzar had now encountered a god who revealed hidden knowledge and rescued condemned servants. He could praise each display of power when it happened before him. What he had not yet learned was how those encounters should govern his own use of power once the immediate wonder had passed. Far to the west, another king under Babylonian authority was approaching that question from the opposite direction. Jehoiachin of Judah had submitted to Nebuchadnezzar, but submission had not erased his desire to escape. As the balance of power shifted again, he would gamble that Babylon's grip could be broken. The gamble began after 3 years of service to Babylon. Jehoiakim stopped paying tribute and rebelled. His decision made sense only if Nebuchadnezzar could be prevented from responding with overwhelming force. Egypt remained the obvious source of hope. Although its army had been driven from the north, it had not ceased to be a major kingdom, and Babylon's attempt to carry the war onto Egyptian ground did not produce an easy victory. A securely preserved Babylonian account records a fierce battle in which both sides suffered heavy losses and Nebuchadnezzar returned home. The following year was spent rebuilding his chariot force and remounting his army. The Babylonian record does not say that this setback caused Jehoiakim's rebellion. It does show the opening a small kingdom could misread. Egypt had survived. Babylon had absorbed losses. Nebuchadnezzar was temporarily occupied with restoring his forces. A king who resented tribute might conclude that the balance was changing again. Jehoiakim chose to act on that possibility. He had already changed masters once without losing his throne. Egypt had placed him there, and Babylon had left him there after taking control. Perhaps another shift seemed survivable. But rebellion against an imperial ruler was more than the suspension of payments. It declared that the subordinate king no longer accepted the political order Nebuchadnezzar had imposed. The response did not begin with Nebuchadnezzar personally appearing outside Jerusalem. The Book of Kings describes bands of Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, and Ammonites moving against Judah. Some belonged directly to Babylon, others came from neighboring peoples able to profit from Judah's vulnerability or serve the dominant power. Their attacks kept pressure on Jehoiakim, while Nebuchadnezzar's main army was elsewhere. For the population beyond Jerusalem's walls, such warfare could be ruinous even before a formal siege. Fields, roads, and smaller settlements lacked the capital's fortifications. Travel became dangerous, local defense weakened, and the resources supporting the royal city were exposed. The text does not narrate individual raids, but their accumulated purpose is clear. Judah was being broken down before the king of Babylon arrived to settle the rebellion. Kings interprets those forces within a longer judgment on Judah. They came at the Lord's command, fulfilling warnings given through the prophets. Jehoiakim's revolt created the immediate political crisis, but the narrative refuses to isolate Jerusalem's fall from generations of violence and unfaithfulness, especially the bloodshed associated with Manasseh. Nebuchadnezzar's campaign had its imperial motives. Within Judah's own history, it also carried consequences that had been repeatedly announced. Egypt did not rescue Jehoiakim. The Egyptian king no longer came out from his land because Babylon had taken the territory once claimed by Egypt, from the border region in the south to the Euphrates in the north. Whatever encouragement Judah drew from Egypt's survival, Pharaoh did not restore the former arrangement. Jehoiakim had rejected one master without securing another protector capable of reaching Jerusalem. By late 598 BC, Nebuchadnezzar was moving west again. The Babylonian Chronicle records that he gathered his army and marched into the region. Judah's rebellion had lasted long enough to demonstrate defiance, but not long enough to alter the strategic reality created at Carchemish. The rebuilt Babylonian force now approached a kingdom already weakened by raids and isolated from effective Egyptian support. Jehoiakim died during the crisis. The Book of Kings says that he rested with his ancestors and that his son Jehoiachin succeeded him. It does not describe the circumstances of his death or say that he reached Babylon. Chronicles compresses the Babylonian action differently, saying that Nebuchadnezzar came against Jehoiakim and bound him with bronze shackles to take him to Babylon. It also associates another removal of temple vessels with the campaign. The accounts agree that Babylon came against him and that his reign ended under that pressure, but they do not provide a single detailed scene of his final hours. His son inherited everything the rebellion had brought upon the kingdom. Jehoiachin is also called Jeconiah and Coniah in the biblical writings. Kings gives his age as 18 when he became king and says he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. The traditional Hebrew text of Chronicles gives 8, while other ancient manuscript evidence supports 18 there as well. His mother was Nehushta, daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem, and she would remain beside him through the approaching surrender and exile. The new king had almost no time to establish himself. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the pattern assigned to his father, but his brief reign was governed by a decision Jehoiakim had already made. Nebuchadnezzar's servants came up against Jerusalem and placed the city under siege. Jerusalem's walls offered protection, but they also concentrated the kingdom's remaining leadership inside the place Babylon intended to take. The royal family, palace officers, military commanders, craftsmen, and accumulated wealth of the capital were all within reach if the siege succeeded. Nebuchadnezzar did not need to destroy every person in Judah to prevent another rebellion. He needed control of the king, the governing class, the defenses, and the people capable of sustaining war. While his forces were besieging the city, Nebuchadnezzar arrived in person. The young Judean king now faced the conqueror his father had defied. There is no recorded battlefield attempt to break out, and no preserved appeal to Egypt. Jehoiachin went out to Nebuchadnezzar with his mother, servants, commanders, and palace officials. It was a royal surrender, deliberately placing the ruling house into Babylonian custody. Nebuchadnezzar took him. Kings dates the capture to the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, using the biblical method of reckoning. The Babylonian Chronicle places it in his 7th year because Babylon treated the month before a king's first New Year festival as his accession year rather than counting them as year 1. That same record gives the capture of Jerusalem on the 2nd day of the month, Adar, corresponding to a day in March 597 BC. For once, the imperial archive and the biblical narrative allow the fall of the city to be located with unusual precision. The Chronicle states the outcome in the language of royal administration. Nebuchadnezzar captured the city, seized its king, appointed a king of his own choice, received heavy tribute, and sent it to Babylon. The biblical accounts enter the city and show what that meant. Nebuchadnezzar carried away the treasures of the temple and the treasures of the royal palace. He cut up gold objects Solomon had made for the sanctuary. The text recalls that this fulfilled what had been spoken concerning Jerusalem's wealth. The first submission had removed part of the sacred vessels. This time, the seizure reached deeply into objects linked with the kingdom's former grandeur. Solomon's name made the loss sharper. The wealth of his reign had represented a time when foreign rulers came to Jerusalem impressed by its wisdom and abundance. Now, A foreign ruler entered as conqueror, dismantled its gold, and carried that wealth toward his own capital. The city itself was not burned in 597. The temple remained standing, and Babylon did not empty Judah completely. Nebuchadnezzar chose a more calculated punishment. He removed the people most able to organize resistance or rebuild independent power. Jehoiachin was deported to Babylon with his mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. Military strength went with them. Kings speaks of 10,000 captives in its broad summary, then specifies 7,000 fighting men and 1,000 craftsmen and metalworkers, all capable of bearing arms or supporting military production. The figures are presented from slightly different angles within the same account, but the profile of the deportation is unmistakable. Officers, experienced soldiers, artisans, smiths, court servants, and leading families were marched away. Only the poorest people of the land were left in the biblical summary. That does not mean every remaining Judean was destitute or that the countryside became entirely empty. It describes the deliberate stripping of Jerusalem's upper levels of leadership, skill, and defense. This removal was larger and more socially disruptive than the earlier taking of selected young nobles. Families now entered exile together. Royal women, commanders, officials, and craftsmen joined the stream toward Babylon. The conqueror was exporting an entire section of Judah's public life. Among the deportees was the priest Ezekiel, whose later visions would be dated from Jehoiachin's exile. That way of counting years preserved the captive king as a reference point even after he lost his throne. In Babylonian eyes, Jehoiachin was a deposed rebel ruler. For many Judeans, his removal marked the moment their own future had been torn away from Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar had several reasons to keep him alive. A captive king could be watched, displayed, and prevented from becoming an active center of resistance at home. His presence in Babylon also reminded the replacement ruler that the empire controlled the dynasty itself. The text does not describe Jehoiachin's first years of confinement here, but his imprisonment would last far beyond the crisis that brought him east. Nebuchadnezzar next addressed the vacant throne. He selected Mattaniah, another son of Josiah, and therefore Jehoiachin's uncle, to govern the reduced kingdom. Mattaniah was 21 years old. He did not inherit power through a free decision by Judah's leadership. He received it because the king of Babylon placed him there. Nebuchadnezzar changed his name to Zedekiah. Royal renaming was a direct mark of authority. Egypt had earlier changed the name of Eliakim to Jehoiakim when Pharaoh Necho installed him. Now Babylon performed the same act on the next surviving ruler. Zedekiah's public identity as king carried the stamp of the man who had captured Jerusalem and chosen him. He would reign 11 years, but the conditions of that reign were already visible. The temple had been plundered, the palace treasury was depleted, the experienced military and administrative class had been carried away. Many skilled workers were gone. His nephew lived as a prisoner in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar's army had demonstrated that Jerusalem's walls could not preserve a rebellious dynasty. The people left behind had also watched surrender, spare the city from immediate destruction. That fact offered a possible path forward. Zedekiah could accept the smaller kingdom entrusted to him, remain loyal to Babylon, and govern those who remained. The cost was humiliation, tribute, and acknowledgment that Judah no longer controlled its own foreign policy. Yet the deportation created competing interpretations of who still mattered. Those left in Jerusalem could see themselves as the fortunate survivors who retained the land, city, and temple. The exiles could appear rejected, removed from the place tied to Judah's worship and national life. The exiles, in turn, still included the deposed king, priests, officials, and many of the kingdom's most capable people. Nebuchadnezzar had divided Judah geographically while attempting to stabilize it politically. He left one Davidic king captive in Babylon and placed another on the throne in Jerusalem. He removed potential rebels, but he also created a displaced community with its own leaders, memories, and claims about the future. Zedekiah stood between those worlds. He owed his crown to Nebuchadnezzar, inherited the consequences of Jehoiakim's rebellion, and governed people already dreaming of reversing the deportation. Egypt remained to the south. Babylon held the exiles to the east. Within Jerusalem, prophets and officials would soon offer sharply different accounts of what God intended to do next. Before Zedekiah chose which voice to trust, both the people left in the city and those taken away had to confront an unsettling possibility. The ones who still possessed Jerusalem might be in greater danger than the ones who had lost it. That possibility was expressed through 2 baskets of figs placed before the temple. Jeremiah saw them after Nebuchadnezzar had carried Jehoiachin, the royal officials, the craftsmen, and the metalworkers from Jerusalem to Babylon. One basket contained very good figs, like the first ripe fruit of the season. The other held figs so spoiled that they could not be eaten. The Lord asked Jeremiah what he saw. "Figs," he answered. "The good figs are very good, and the bad figs are very bad." The objects were ordinary, and the difference between them was obvious. What was not obvious was whom they represented. The good figs stood for the Judean exiles Nebuchadnezzar had sent away. To the people who still possessed homes in Judah, that comparison could sound completely reversed. Deportation looked like rejection. The exiles had lost the land, the temple, their political standing, and the ordinary structures of life. Jerusalem's survivors could still see the sanctuary and continue the kingdom under a son of Josiah. Yet God said he would regard the deportees for good. He would eventually bring them back, build them rather than tear them down, and plant them rather than uproot them. He would give them a heart to know him, and they would return to him wholeheartedly. The bad figs represented Zedekiah, his officials, those remaining in Jerusalem, and those who sought refuge in Egypt. Their continued presence in or near the land offered no guarantee of safety. Jeremiah said they would be exposed to disaster, disgrace, sword, famine, and disease until they were removed. This was a statement about the direction of the 2 communities, not a claim that every deportee was personally faithful or that every resident of Judah had the same character. The vision overturned the assumption that location proved favor. Babylon held people through whom Judah's future could be rebuilt. Jerusalem held a government moving toward another judgment. That government began with an oath. When Nebuchadnezzar installed Zedekiah, he did not simply give him a crown and depart. He placed him under covenant and made him swear loyalty. Chronicles says the oath was taken in God's name. For Zedekiah, breaking it would therefore become more than a political calculation. He would be violating a pledged commitment made under the authority of the God of Judah. The arrangement was designed to keep the kingdom low but stable. Babylon did not expect Zedekiah to recover the territory or prestige associated with earlier Judean kings. Nebuchadnezzar wanted a subordinate state that could endure precisely because it no longer attempted to act as an independent regional power. Zedekiah retained real responsibilities within that reduced space. He governed Jerusalem, administered the towns still functioning under Judah, dealt with priests and officials, and remained the public representative of David's dynasty. He could make domestic decisions so long as they did not challenge Babylon's supremacy. Tribute, loyalty, and the avoidance of foreign alliances were the price of keeping the throne. His position carried an immediate contradiction. The king was expected to embody Judah's continuity, yet his authority advertised Judah's defeat. The royal name by which he was now known had been given by Nebuchadnezzar. His nephew, the previous king, remained alive in Babylon. Many people whom the nation would ordinarily depend on had been removed. Every official who entered Zedekiah's court knew that another king had selected him and could remove him. The exiles also kept Jehoiachin's claim from disappearing. Even in captivity, he remained the man who had inherited the throne from Jehoiakim. Biblical writers continued to identify him as king, and the years of deportation could be counted from his removal. Zedekiah ruled in Jerusalem, but the dynasty now had two centers, an appointed uncle in the city and a captive nephew in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar could tolerate that ambiguity because he controlled both men. Jehoiachin was confined within the imperial system. Zedekiah was bound by oath and dependent on Babylonian permission. From the conqueror's perspective, the division reduced the possibility that either could act freely. Ezekiel later presented the political arrangement as a riddle involving eagles, a cedar, and a vine. A great eagle appeared with powerful wings, long feathers, and richly colored plumage. It came to Lebanon, took hold of the top of a cedar, broke off its highest shoot, and carried it to a land of merchants, placing it in a city of traders. The eagle was Nebuchadnezzar. The cedar represented the royal house in Jerusalem. The highest shoot was Jehoiachin, and the ruling elite removed to Babylon. The image did not portray the deportation as an accidental consequence of battle. The eagle deliberately selected the top growth and transplanted it into the commercial center of its own world. Then the eagle took some of the seed of the land and planted it in fertile soil beside abundant waters. It placed the seed like a willow where it could grow. The plant became a low, spreading vine. Its branches turned toward the eagle, and its roots remained beneath it. It produced branches and sent out shoots. That seed was Zedekiah. The image defined what Nebuchadnezzar expected from him. Zedekiah was not planted to become another towering cedar. He was allowed to grow as a low vine under the protection and control of the eagle. If his branches remained directed toward Babylon and his roots stayed within the arrangement made for him, the vine could live. This was the conqueror's alternative to another destruction of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar had already proved that he could capture the city. Instead of razing it, he replanted part of the royal line in conditions chosen to prevent renewed independence. The survival of Zedekiah's kingdom depended on accepting that reduced form. But Ezekiel's riddle introduced a second great eagle. This eagle also had large wings and abundant plumage. The vine began bending its roots toward him and stretching its branches in his direction, seeking water from somewhere other than the ground where it had been planted. The second eagle represented Egypt. The attraction was easy to understand. Egypt was the only neighboring great power with the size and military tradition to appear capable of challenging Babylon. It had lost its northern territories, but it still possessed horses, troops, wealth, and the prestige of an ancient kingdom. Jerusalem's leaders could imagine that an alliance with Pharaoh might restore the freedom lost under Nebuchadnezzar. The vine was already planted in good soil with sufficient water to grow. Its turn toward Egypt therefore came from dissatisfaction with the limits of its permitted life, not from the absence of any path to survival. Zedekiah wanted the security Babylon allowed without the submission Babylon required. Ezekiel asked whether such a vine could prosper. Would the first eagle not pull up its roots, strip its fruit, and leave its fresh growth to wither? No great army would be needed to uproot it. Even if it had been transplanted, it would not thrive once the east wind struck it. The riddle then became a direct accusation. The king of Babylon had come to Jerusalem, taken its king and princes, and brought them to himself. He had selected a member of the royal family, made a covenant with him, and placed him under oath. He had also removed the leading men so that the kingdom would remain humble, unable to rise independently, yet capable of standing if it kept the covenant. Zedekiah's temptation was to treat that oath as a temporary necessity rather than a binding responsibility. Ezekiel spoke of him sending messengers to Egypt to obtain horses and a large army. Diplomatic contact could begin before open revolt, testing whether Pharaoh would provide enough support to make resistance plausible. The prophet's answer was severe. A man who broke such a covenant would not escape. Ezekiel delivered that judgment in Babylon, among people who had already felt the consequence of Jehoiakim's failed rebellion. They knew what it meant for a Judean king to depend on Egypt and misjudge Nebuchadnezzar's ability to return. The riddle transformed the next political crisis into a familiar pattern before its final outcome arrived. It also placed responsibilities squarely on Zedekiah. He had not been forced onto the throne against a declared promise of resistance. He accepted kingship through Nebuchadnezzar's appointment and swore the oath that made his rule possible. If he later turned to Egypt, he could not describe the resulting war as an unprovoked Babylonian attack. The oath did not make Nebuchadnezzar benevolent. He was an imperial conqueror, preserving control over a defeated kingdom. But Zedekiah's obligation did not depend on Babylon's innocence. It depended on the commitment he had made and on the repeated prophetic warning that resistance would destroy the city he was supposed to govern. For the moment, Jerusalem still functioned. The temple remained the center of public worship. Priests continued their service. Royal officials continued to advise the king. Houses, fields, and family life had not disappeared. The scale of the 597 deportation was enormous, but it had left enough of the kingdom intact for Zedekiah to choose a different course from his brother. That remaining normality could disguise how narrow the margin had become. The city had already lost much of its wealth and military strength. Nebuchadnezzar had not forgotten the route to Jerusalem. A new rebellion would not be judged as the first act of resistance by an untouched kingdom. It would be a second breach after surrender, deportation, reinstatement, and oath. The people left behind had reasons to resist Jeremiah's interpretation of their position. They could point to physical evidence. They were still in the land. The temple vessels had been diminished, but the temple stood. Jehoiachin had been carried away, but Zedekiah sat on David's throne. If exile were truly the place where God intended to preserve the future, then familiar assumptions about Jerusalem's security had to be surrendered. The exiles faced a different struggle. Jeremiah's promise of eventual restoration did not mean a quick return. They had to live with the loss of status, home, and sacred geography without accepting Babylon's claim to own their identity. Hope could sustain them, but an impatient version of hope could also make them vulnerable to anyone promising that Nebuchadnezzar's power was about to collapse. That promise soon began to circulate. Prophets claimed that Babylon's dominance would be brief, Jehoiachin would return, and the temple vessels would be restored. Such words appealed to both communities. The exiles wanted to go home. Jerusalem's leaders wanted their depleted kingdom made whole. Zedekiah wanted freedom from an oath that defined him as subordinate. Jeremiah's vision required them to accept a harder sequence. The deportation was real and would not be reversed by wishful prediction. The people in Babylon had to prepare for life there. The people in Jerusalem had to abandon confidence based solely on possessing the city. Zedekiah had to remain within the covenant he had sworn. Nebuchadnezzar's policy and Jeremiah's message therefore converged on one immediate demand. Though for very different reasons, Judah should not rebel. The king of Babylon required submission to preserve his empire. Jeremiah urged submission because resistance would bring a destruction the surviving kingdom could still avoid. Between those two pressures stood prophets who offered a far more welcome future. Babylon broken quickly, the exiles restored, and Jerusalem vindicated without surrendering its ambitions. Their predictions would not remain abstract. Messages would travel between Jerusalem and Babylon. Exiles would have to decide whether to settle or wait. Zedekiah would receive envoys and weigh alliances. In the temple itself, one prophet would seize Jeremiah's symbol of submission and break it before the watching priests and people. One of those messages went east in the hands of two royal envoys. Zedekiah sent Elasah, son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. The purpose of their official mission is not given, but Jeremiah used the journey to deliver a letter to the people deported with Jehoiachin. It was addressed to the surviving elders, priests, prophets, and the rest of the exiled community. The letter began with an instruction that cut directly against expectations of an immediate return. Build houses and live in them. They were to plant gardens and eat what those gardens produced. They were to marry and have sons and daughters. They were to arrange marriages for the next generation so that their children could also have families. They were to increase in Babylon rather than decrease. These were ordinary actions, but together they required a long horizon. A house was built for continued use. A garden required seasons of labor before its produce could be enjoyed. Marriages and children moved hope beyond the adults who remembered Jerusalem into a generation growing up outside it. Jeremiah was telling the exiles to stop organizing their lives around the assumption that departure was imminent. That did not mean they were to become Babylonians in worship or forget the land from which they had been taken. It meant captivity would not be shortened by refusing to live. Their future as a people depended on forming households, raising children, and accepting the daily work available during an exile they had not chosen. Then came a more difficult command. They were to seek the welfare of the city to which God had sent them and pray to the Lord on its behalf, because its welfare would affect their own. The city was Babylon, the capital of the king who had removed them. Its wealth included tribute and sacred objects taken from defeated nations. Its officials supervised their displacement, and its army remained the threat hanging over those left in Judah. Jeremiah did not ask the exiles to call those actions just. He told them to work for the city's peace because their families would live within its conditions. If Babylon enjoyed order, they could build, plant, raise children, and maintain a community. If the city collapsed into violence, invasion, famine, or political chaos, the exiles would suffer with everyone else. Seeking its welfare was therefore a way of protecting life without pretending that exile was home. Prayer made the command more demanding. They were not simply to comply with Babylonian administration from necessity. They were to ask the God of Jerusalem to grant peace to the place holding them. Their captors did not control whom they addressed in prayer, but their prayers were to include the captors' city. Jeremiah immediately warned them not to trust every religious voice speaking among them. Prophets and diviners in Babylon were promising another outcome. Some exiles were also treating their own dreams as confirmation that the crisis would end quickly. "Do not let them deceive you," the letter said. Those people were prophesying falsely in God's name. He had not sent them. The problem was not that they offered hope. Jeremiah's letter contained a firm promise of restoration. The deception concerned its timing and the life required before it arrived. A hope that denied the appointed duration of exile encouraged people to reject the very practices by which the community would survive it. Jeremiah named the period when 70 years were completed for Babylon. God would visit the exiles, fulfill his good word, and bring them back. The figure placed restoration beyond any plausible 2-year prediction circulating among them. Exactly how the 70 years is reckoned has been discussed in different ways, but its immediate force in the letter is clear. Babylon's dominance would last for the span God had determined. Many adults receiving the message could not assume they would personally walk back into Jerusalem. They were being asked to prepare a future they might know chiefly through their children. Then Jeremiah gave the assurance that would become one of the most remembered lines in the letter. God knew the plans he had for them, plans for welfare and not disaster, to give them a future and a hope. Spoken apart from the letter, those words can sound like a promise of rapid personal success. Here, they were addressed to a displaced community being told to build houses in Babylon and wait through decades. The promised good did not cancel the exile. It assured them that exile was not the end of their story. They would call upon God, come and pray, and he would hear them. They would seek him and find him when they sought with all their heart. He would restore their fortunes, gather them from the nations and places where they had been driven, and return them to the land from which they had been sent away. The sequence mattered. Houses and gardens came before return. Prayer continued during Babylon's ascendancy. Restoration remained certain, but the exiles could not produce it by announcing that it had already begun. Jeremiah also addressed an objection taking shape among them. Some were saying that the Lord had raised up prophets for them in Babylon. If true, those prophets could appear to replace or contradict the warning coming from Jerusalem. The existence of a speaker among the exiles did not prove that God had commissioned him. Meanwhile, the king and people remaining in Jerusalem faced the judgment symbolized by the bad figs. Jeremiah repeated that sword, famine, and disease would come against those who refused the word already given. They would become an object of horror and reproach among the nations. The letter therefore denied both communities the conclusion they most wanted. The exiles could not say that their removal would end almost immediately. Jerusalem's residents could not say that remaining near the temple guaranteed their safety. Each group had to respond to its own responsibility rather than treating the condition of the other as proof of divine rejection. Two prophets in Babylon turned the dispute into a public scandal. Their names were Ahab, son of Koliah, and Zedekiah, son of Maaseiah. They spoke lies in God's name and committed adultery with their neighbors' wives. Jeremiah said God knew what they had done and was witness to it. Their private conduct and public claims belonged to the same false authority. They used a prophetic position that had not been given to them. Jeremiah announced that Nebuchadnezzar would execute them before the eyes of the exiles. The king of Babylon had them burned in the fire. The account does not describe their arrest or trial, and it does not say that Nebuchadnezzar acted from concern for Jeremiah's message. From Babylon's perspective, they may have been dangerous for reasons connected to order or rebellion. Within Jeremiah's letter, their deaths confirmed that the men promising falsely in God's name could not protect themselves from the empire they claimed would soon fall. Their fate became a curse spoken among the Judean exiles. May the Lord make you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. The sentence was meant to be remembered. These were not prophets whose boldness led to vindication. Their names became a warning attached to disgrace, abuse, and death. Another prophet in Babylon answered Jeremiah more directly. Shemaiah, called the Nehelamite, sent letters in his own name to people in Jerusalem. One was addressed to Zephaniah, son of Maaseiah the priest, with copies or messages also directed to the other priests. Shemaiah attempted to use Jerusalem's religious authorities against Jeremiah. He reminded Zephaniah that he had been placed in the temple with responsibility for maintaining order. According to Shemaiah, that duty included controlling anyone who behaved like a madman and presented himself as a prophet. Such a person should be put in stocks and an iron collar. Then Shemaiah named Jeremiah. Why, he asked, had Zephaniah not rebuked the man from Anathoth who was prophesying to the exiles? Jeremiah had told them that their captivity would be long and that they should build houses, live in them, plant gardens, and eat their produce. Shemaiah quoted the practical instructions as evidence against Jeremiah. To him, settling in Babylon sounded like surrender to a false future. If the exile ought to end quickly, building houses could be portrayed as disbelief. The action Jeremiah intended as faithful endurance became, in Shemaiah's accusation, grounds for restraining him as a dangerous fanatic. The attempt also exposed how connected the two Judean communities remained. A prophet in Babylon could write to a priest in Jerusalem, comment on a letter traveling in the opposite direction, and try to activate temple discipline against its author. Distance had not separated the argument. It had created a correspondence network through which competing claims could move. Zephaniah read Shemaiah's letter aloud to Jeremiah. He did not place Jeremiah in the stocks. The fact that he showed him the accusation allowed Jeremiah to answer it openly. A new message went from Jerusalem to all the exiles. God had not sent Shemaiah, Jeremiah declared. Shemaiah had prophesied to them and made them trust a lie. Because he had taught rebellion, he would be punished. He would have no descendant living among the people, and he would not see the good that God would do for them. The final clause carried particular force. Shemaiah opposed the long exile in the name of hope, yet Jeremiah said his false promise would keep him from seeing the genuine good that eventually came. Rejecting God's timing did not hasten restoration. It separated the false prophet from it. These exchanges made the issue increasingly concrete. The exiles were deciding whether to unpack their lives or wait for imminent departure. Priests in Jerusalem were deciding whether Jeremiah belonged among recognized prophets or in restraints. Zedekiah's administration was carrying correspondence, while the king himself remained bound by an oath to Nebuchadnezzar. The promise of a quick reversal could attract people for several different reasons. Families wanted reunification. Priests wanted the missing vessels returned. Royal supporters wanted Jehoiachin restored. Officials left in Judah wanted the damage of 597 undone without further submission. Each desire could make a short timetable feel morally compelling. Jeremiah's message offered no date his audience could manipulate. 70 years placed the end under God's control and required obedience within present conditions. The exiles could seek Babylon's peace without declaring Babylon permanent. They could pray for return without behaving as though it had already been ordered. In Jerusalem, however, the same long timetable sounded like an endorsement of the political humiliation many leaders wanted to reverse. If Babylon would remain dominant, Zedekiah's oath had to be honored. Tribute had to continue, and Egypt could not be treated as an immediate path to independence. The disagreement was moving from letters into statecraft. In the 4th year of Zedekiah, envoys from neighboring kingdoms appeared in Jerusalem. Their rulers faced the same imperial pressure and the same temptation to coordinate resistance. Jeremiah entered that gathering wearing a yoke, turning Babylonian supremacy into something the diplomats and the king could see. Another prophet would answer with a simpler gesture. He would take the yoke from Jeremiah's neck and break it. Before Hananiah broke it, Jeremiah had carried the yoke into a gathering charged with political consequence. The visiting envoys represented Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, and Sidon. Their masters ruled territories surrounding Judah to the east and north, and all had reason to watch Babylon's strength carefully. They had come to Jerusalem to meet with Zedekiah, apparently exploring a coordinated response to Nebuchadnezzar's control. A coalition could make resistance seem less reckless. Babylon had conquered the region by defeating kingdoms and armies that faced it separately. If several subject states acted together, perhaps they could divide Nebuchadnezzar's forces, support one another, and secure Egyptian involvement. Jerusalem's position among the delegations also offered Zedekiah something he badly wanted: the appearance that he was a participant in regional strategy rather than a vassal waiting for Babylon's instructions. Jeremiah was told to make straps and yoke bars and place them on his neck. A yoke normally transferred the strength of an animal to the work chosen by its master. Worn by a man, it became a visible sign of subjection. Jeremiah did not send the diplomats a private theological opinion about their negotiations. He entered their political world carrying the result of the policy they were considering. Through the envoys, he sent a message to their kings. The God of Israel had made the earth, humanity, and the animals by his great power, Jeremiah said, and he gave them to whomever he chose. At that time, he had given their lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Even the wild animals were placed under his authority. Jeremiah called Nebuchadnezzar, "my servant." The title did not describe the Babylonian king as a faithful worshipper or excuse the violence of imperial conquest. It identified him as the ruler being used to carry out a purpose larger than his own ambitions. Nebuchadnezzar thought in terms of campaigns, tribute, loyalty, and punishment. Jeremiah told the gathered kingdoms that resisting him at this moment meant resisting the judgment God had appointed. The nations would serve Nebuchadnezzar, then his son and grandson, until Babylon's own time arrived. Its dominance had a limit, but the surrounding rulers could not bring that limit forward by declaring it convenient. When Babylon's appointed period ended, other nations and great kings would make it their servant. For the present, any nation that refused to place its neck under Nebuchadnezzar's yoke would face sword, famine, and disease until Babylon consumed it. Jeremiah warned the rulers not to trust prophets, diviners, dreamers, fortune-tellers, or sorcerers who told them they would not serve the king of Babylon. Those voices were offering the answer the coalition wanted, but their promise would help remove the nations from their own lands. A nation that accepted the yoke would be allowed to remain, cultivate its land, and live there. That was the choice set before the envoys. Submission was humiliating, but it preserved people and place. Rebellion promised dignity and produced the conditions in which Babylon could invade, besiege, depopulate, and appoint another government. Jeremiah delivered the same warning directly to Zedekiah. Bring your neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, serve him and his people, and live. The king was not being asked to approve of everything Babylon had done. He was being told how to prevent the destruction still avoidable. Jeremiah asked why Zedekiah and his people should die by sword, famine, and disease, the very consequences appointed for a kingdom that refused Babylon's rule. Other prophets were telling Zedekiah that he would not serve Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah called their message false. God had not sent them, and trusting them would end with king, prophets, and people driven from the land. Then Jeremiah turned from the court to the priests and the public. A related promise was circulating around the temple. The vessels already taken to Babylon would soon be returned. Those objects carried enormous emotional force. Their absence was a visible wound inside the sanctuary and a daily reminder that Nebuchadnezzar had entered Judah's sacred life. Predicting their quick restoration made political independence sound like the recovery of worship itself. Jeremiah told the priests not to listen. If those speakers were genuine prophets and truly possessed the word of the Lord, they should pray that the vessels still remaining in the temple and palace would not also be carried to Babylon. The immediate need was not an announcement that the first loss would be undone. It was repentance, capable of preventing a greater loss. Several major bronze objects from Solomon's temple remained in Jerusalem, including the pillars, the great basin known as the sea, and the movable stands. Nebuchadnezzar had left them in 597. Jeremiah said they too would eventually be taken if the city continued on its course. They would remain in Babylon until the time God chose to attend to them. The warning placed the temple inside the consequences of Zedekiah's decision. Sacred objects would not shield the city from a broken oath. If Jerusalem rebelled, Babylon would not treat the sanctuary as territory beyond imperial reach. In the 5th month of Zedekiah's 4th year, the dispute became a direct public confrontation. Hananiah, son of Azur, came from Gibeon. a town with priestly associations not far from Jerusalem. He was recognized as a prophet and spoke inside the temple before the priests and all the people. He did not present his words as speculation or encouragement. He used the authoritative formula Jeremiah used. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon. Hananiah announced a precise timetable. Within 2 years, God would bring back all the temple vessels Nebuchadnezzar had carried to Babylon. Jehoiachin would return with all the exiles from Judah. Babylon's yoke would be broken. His message answered every painful feature of the present crisis. The missing vessels would come home, the captive king would come home, the separated population would come home, Zedekiah would be released from dependence. The restoration would happen soon enough for the adults listening in the temple to expect to see it themselves. Jeremiah answered in front of the same audience, Amen, may the Lord do so. He did not oppose restoration or take satisfaction in Babylonian dominance. He wanted Hananiah's promise to be true. May the Lord fulfill those words, Jeremiah said, and bring the vessels and exiles back from Babylon. Then he asked the priests and people to listen carefully. The prophets who preceded both men had commonly warned of war, disaster, and disease against powerful countries and kingdoms. When a prophet announced peace, fulfillment became the test by which that prophet would be known as truly sent. Jeremiah's response did not settle the confrontation at once. Hananiah had used God's name, spoken confidently, and offered a near date. His audience would not need to wait through an undefined future to evaluate him. 2 years would prove whether the vessels and exiles returned. Hananiah then took hold of the yoke bars on Jeremiah's neck. He broke them. The act turned his prophecy into a scene the entire temple assembly could understand. The wooden symbol of Babylonian submission lay broken before them, apparently answering Jeremiah's warning with equal prophetic force. Hananiah repeated his message. In the same way, within 2 years, God would break Nebuchadnezzar's yoke from the neck of all the nations. Jeremiah walked away. He did not fight to recover the broken wood, call guards, or try to overwhelm Hananiah with a longer speech. For the moment, the public gesture stood. The prophet urging submission left the temple while the prophet promising freedom remained with the vivid final image. That departure allowed Hananiah's act to land before the answer came. Breaking a symbol was easy. Changing the imperial reality it represented required something neither prophet could produce by performance. Afterward, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. He was told to return to Hananiah with a new message. You have broken wooden yoke bars, but you have made in their place bars of iron. The attempted reversal had intensified the sign. Wood could be snapped before a crowd. Iron could not. Hananiah had not weakened Babylon's control by denying it. He had encouraged the choices that would make that control harsher. Jeremiah announced that an iron yoke had been placed on the nations so that they would serve Nebuchadnezzar. The animals of the field were again included in the grant of authority. The regional order Hananiah promised to break within 2 years remained firmly in Babylon's hands. Then Jeremiah addressed Hananiah personally. Listen, Hananiah, the Lord has not sent you, and you have made this people trust in a lie. Because Hananiah had taught rebellion against the Lord, he would die that same year. The prophecy narrowed the test from the fate of empires to the life of the man standing before Jeremiah. Hananiah had promised events within 2 years. Jeremiah said Hananiah himself had only months. In the 7th month, Hananiah died. His death came 2 months after the temple confrontation. Jehoiachin had not returned. The vessels remained in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's authority over the region had not broken. The man who snapped the yoke and announced liberation did not live to see even the first year of his own timetable completed. For the priests and people who witnessed both prophets, The event provided an immediate judgment on competing claims. Hananiah's confidence, public standing, and dramatic gesture had not made his message true. Jeremiah's yoke had been destroyed as an object, but the warning attached to it remained. Zedekiah could no longer treat the controversy as an argument without evidence. A prophet who encouraged resistance had named a deadline and then died under a counter-prophecy. The king also knew the practical facts. Babylon still held Jehoiachin, the exiles, and the temple treasures. The surrounding states had not freed themselves. Egypt had not displaced Nebuchadnezzar. Yet accepting Jeremiah's counsel required Zedekiah to govern without the independent status expected of a king. He would have to disappoint officials who saw coalition as courage, reject prophets who clothed resistance in divine approval, and maintain an oath many of his subjects experienced as national humiliation. Hananiah's death discredited one promise of rapid release, but it did not remove the desire that made the promise persuasive. Other advisors could use different language. Diplomats could produce fresh assurances. Egypt could offer horses and troops instead of prophetic certainty. Nebuchadnezzar had left Zedekiah enough authority to preserve Judah as a low kingdom. That very authority allowed him to imagine becoming something more. As the years passed, patience with Babylon weakened, and the political contact symbolized by the second eagle moved closer to formal alliance. The wooden yoke was gone from Jeremiah's neck. The iron one was about to descend on Jerusalem. Zedekiah finally refused to serve Babylon. His rebellion completed the choice Ezekiel had pictured in the vine turning toward Egypt. It also violated the oath that had allowed him to reign. Chronicles describes the king as stiff-necked and unwilling to humble himself before Jeremiah's warning. Nebuchadnezzar no longer faced a hesitant vassal exploring alternatives. He faced a subordinate ruler who had broken covenant and rejected imperial authority. Babylon responded with war. In the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar came against Jerusalem with his entire army. Babylonian forces camped around the city and built siege works against it. The dating is repeated across the biblical accounts because that day began the final isolation of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar's army was more than a body of soldiers recruited from Babylon itself. Jeremiah describes kingdoms and peoples under his dominion participating in the campaign. Imperial conquest supplied the manpower for further conquest. Subject peoples who might once have resisted Babylon now appeared as parts of the force sent to punish Judah. Other Judean strongholds were attacked as the invasion narrowed around the capital. Lachish and Azekah remained among the last fortified cities still holding out. Their survival mattered because they guarded approaches through the lowlands and could delay complete Babylonian control. When only a few fortified places remained, Jerusalem could no longer imagine that the countryside would absorb the invasion while the royal city continued normally. Ezekiel, speaking among the exiles, portrayed Nebuchadnezzar's advance through a scene at a crossroads. The Babylonian king came to a place where one road led toward Rabbah, capital of the Ammonites, and the other toward fortified Jerusalem. Both kingdoms had been involved in the atmosphere of resistance. Nebuchadnezzar had to determine where his force would strike. In Ezekiel's portrayal, he used the divinatory methods of his own religion. He shook or cast arrows, consulted household gods, and examined a liver. Such practices belonged to the ancient attempt to obtain divine direction before a major decision. The biblical text does not endorse the methods. It shows the pagan conqueror receiving the result that placed him on the road appointed for judgment. The decision fell in his right hand, Jerusalem. The result called for battering rams, commands for slaughter, a battle cry, siege ramps, and walls of assault. To the people of Jerusalem, the omen could appear false. They had their own oaths, religious claims, and expectations of protection. Yet Ezekiel said their guilt would be remembered and they would be taken. He addressed Zedekiah as the profane and wicked prince of Israel, whose day had arrived. The royal turban would be removed, the crown taken away, and the established order overturned. The high would be brought low. The throne Zedekiah had tried to free from Babylon would disappear under the consequences of his revolt. Outside Jerusalem, the prophetic imagery became military fact. A siege did not require the attackers to force an immediate entry. Babylon could surround the city, restrict movement, construct assault positions, and wait while conditions inside deteriorated. Jerusalem's walls, elevation, and defenses made it costly to storm, but the same walls could trap a population dependent on stored food and access to water. Zedekiah turned to Jeremiah. He sent Pasha, son of Malchijah, and Zephaniah, son of Maaseiah, the priest, with a request, "Inquire of the Lord for us, because Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is making war against us." The king still hoped for an intervention drawn from Jerusalem's sacred memory. Perhaps, he said, the Lord would deal with them according to all his wonderful deeds and make Nebuchadnezzar withdraw. There were stories behind that hope. Jerusalem had survived an Assyrian threat generations earlier when the invading army withdrew during Hezekiah's reign. The city's temple and royal traditions made sudden deliverance imaginable. Zedekiah wanted to know whether the God who had rescued Jerusalem before would do so again. Jeremiah's answer allowed no such expectation. The weapons in the hands of Jerusalem's defenders would be turned back. Babylonian forces outside the walls would be gathered into the city. More devastatingly, God himself would fight against Jerusalem with an outstretched hand and mighty arm in anger and great wrath. The language reversed the vocabulary of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. The divine power, once described as acting against an oppressor, was now directed against the city whose king sought Egyptian help. Jerusalem could not claim the pattern of earlier salvation while persisting in the conduct Jeremiah had condemned. People and animals within the city would be struck by severe disease. Zedekiah, his servants, and those who survived disease, sword, and famine would be handed to Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian king would not show the pity on which a defeated rebel might hope to rely. Jeremiah then gave the people two paths. The way of life and the way of death were set before them. Whoever remained in the city would die by sword, famine, or disease. Whoever went out and surrendered to the Chaldeans would live, carrying away life itself as the spoil of war. This was the most practical and most politically dangerous part of Jeremiah's message. Once siege began, urging surrender could be heard as assistance to the enemy. Yet he did not promise safety through passive acceptance inside the walls. Survival required a visible departure from the city's chosen defense. Jerusalem would be given into Nebuchadnezzar's hand and burned with fire. The royal house received its own warning. It was still responsible to administer justice, rescue the robbed from the oppressor, and prevent violence against the vulnerable. Siege did not suspend that obligation. If anything, the narrowing time made it more urgent. One issue within the city exposed how Judah's powerful families had treated that responsibility. Hebrew men and women were being held as slaves by fellow Judeans. Israel's law did not treat an impoverished member of the covenant community as permanent property. Release was required, yet the practice had been ignored or manipulated. People who shared the identity of a delivered nation had brought their own brothers and sisters into enduring bondage. With Babylon surrounding Jerusalem, Zedekiah made a covenant with the people to proclaim liberty. The king, officials, and inhabitants agreed that every Hebrew male and female slave would be released. No Judean was to hold a fellow Judean in bondage. The leaders and people entered the covenant and set those servants free. This was not a private act of generosity by a few households. It was a public commitment involving the king and the community. They sealed it through a covenant ceremony in which a calf was cut in two and the participants passed between the pieces. That form of oath placed the covenant makers under a vivid self-judgment. By walking between the divided parts, they accepted the consequence of becoming like the sacrificed animal if they violated their word. The leaders knew they were not making a temporary administrative adjustment. They were binding themselves before God. The release also changed the city's immediate social order. Men and women who had been controlled by other Judeans were allowed to leave their service. Under siege, when every household faced scarcity and every available worker could seem valuable, owners surrendered claims they had previously refused to relinquish. Fear may have sharpened their willingness, but the command itself was not new. The crisis did not invent the obligation, it forced the city to acknowledge it. For a brief period, Jerusalem's leaders did what the covenant required. The slaves went free. The king, who had broken his oath to Nebuchadnezzar, presided over a new oath inside the city, and people who had resisted Jeremiah's warnings corrected a specific injustice. Outside the walls, Babylon maintained its pressure. Nebuchadnezzar's forces had come prepared for a sustained operation. Siege ramps and earthworks brought attackers closer to the defenses. Battering equipment threatened gates and walls. Watchmen on Jerusalem's fortifications could see that the army was not passing through Judah on its way to another target. The choice at the crossroads had reached them. Then news changed the military situation. An Egyptian army had set out. Zedekiah's appeal to Egypt was producing a visible response. Pharaoh's force moved northward, creating the possibility that Babylon's besieging army could be attacked or cut off while positioned around Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar now had to account for a second army approaching from the south. The Chaldeans withdrew from Jerusalem to meet the Egyptian threat. For the people inside, the change must have been undeniable. Babylonian troops who had sealed the city began pulling away. Routes opened. The immediate machinery of the siege no longer pressed against the walls. Zedekiah had rebelled, Egypt had advanced, and Nebuchadnezzar's army had departed. No prophetic interpretation was needed to see the physical relief. The king's foreign policy appeared to be working. The timing also changed the apparent meaning of the slave release. Jerusalem had proclaimed liberty while under threat, and then the threat receded. Those inclined to read events as approval could connect reform with rescue. The city had entered a covenant, set captives free, and watched the besiegers withdraw. Yet Jeremiah had not said Babylon would remain in place without interruption. He had said the city would be given into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. A temporary movement of troops did not cancel that outcome. Zedekiah asked Jeremiah about the new situation through another delegation. The king sent Jehoiachin son of Shelemiah with Zephaniah the priest, asking Jeremiah to pray for the people. The Egyptian army had come out, and the Chaldeans had lifted the siege. Jeremiah answered that Pharaoh's army would return to Egypt. The Chaldeans would come back, fight against Jerusalem, capture it, and burn it. The people must not deceive themselves by saying the Babylonians had gone away for good. Even if Judah somehow struck the entire Babylonian army and left only wounded men in their tents, Jeremiah said, those wounded men would rise and burn the city. The warning stripped military arithmetic of its power to reassure. Jerusalem's survival did not depend on whether Egypt could inflict enough casualties. The outcome had been fixed by choices already made and refusals repeatedly confirmed. For the moment, however, the roads outside Jerusalem were open. The enemy had withdrawn, and the population could breathe again. Fear receded faster than the commitments fear had produced. The people who had released their slaves began to reconsider what freedom was costing them. The king, who had asked for prayer, still would not accept the answer. And as Babylon moved to face Egypt, Jerusalem mistook an interval in the siege for the end of it. The reconsideration became betrayal. The former owners took back the men and women they had released and forced them into slavery again. The covenant made in the temple had lasted only while Babylon's army seemed ready to destroy the city. Once the immediate pressure lifted, those who had surrendered control over their servants reclaimed it. Jeremiah said they had profaned God's name. He reminded them that Israel's own history began with release from bondage. The covenant required a Hebrew servant to go free after a limited term, yet earlier generations had refused to listen. During the siege, Jerusalem's leaders had finally done what was right. They proclaimed liberty, entered a covenant in the temple, and released their fellow Judeans. Then they turned around and made the freed people slaves again. Jeremiah answered their false proclamation of liberty with one of his own. Since they would not release their brothers and sisters, God would release them to sword, disease, and famine. The word they had celebrated would return with a meaning directed against them. The officials, royal officers, priests, and people who passed between the pieces of the calf had invoked covenant judgment on themselves. Jeremiah said they would be handed to their enemies, and their bodies would become food for birds and animals. Zedekiah and his officials would also be given into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian army had withdrawn, but Jeremiah addressed that apparent obstacle directly. God would command the Chaldeans to return. They would fight against Jerusalem, capture it and burn it. The towns of Judah would be left desolate. While the Chaldeans were still away from the city, Jeremiah attempted to leave Jerusalem. He set out toward the territory of Benjamin to attend to a family property matter among his people. Anathoth, his hometown, lay in that direction beyond the city. With the siege temporarily lifted, movement through the gate had become possible again. At the Benjamin gate, an officer named Irijah stopped him. Irijah was the son of Shelemiah and grandson of Hananiah. He accused Jeremiah of deserting to the Chaldeans. "That is a lie," Jeremiah answered. "I am not deserting to the Chaldeans." The accusation was believable enough to be dangerous. Jeremiah had repeatedly told the people that anyone who surrendered to Babylon would live. He had said Nebuchadnezzar would capture the city and that resistance would fail. To officials committed to Jerusalem's defense, those prophecies could sound indistinguishable from enemy advocacy. Irijah refused to listen. He arrested Jeremiah and brought him before the officials. They were enraged with the prophet. They beat him and confined him in the house of Jonathan the secretary, which had been converted into a prison. Jeremiah was placed in a vaulted cell or dungeon room and remained there many days. The man who had urged surrender was now prevented from leaving the city at all. His treatment also showed what Zedekiah's administration did with unwelcome information. The king continued asking for prophetic counsel while his officials punished the prophet whose answer did not support their policy. After Jeremiah had spent a long time in confinement, Zedekiah sent for him secretly. The king received him in the palace and asked, "Is there any word from the Lord?" Jeremiah said there was. "You will be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon." Imprisonment had not altered the message. Jeremiah did not soften it to gain release or offer the king a private version different from what he had said publicly. He then challenged the basis of his treatment. What offense had he committed against the king, his servants, or the people to deserve prison? Where were the prophets who had told Zedekiah that the king of Babylon would not come against him and the land? Their prediction had failed in the most visible way possible. Nebuchadnezzar had come, and even if his troops had moved temporarily, the siege was not over. Yet the prophet whose warning proved accurate occupied the dungeon, while those who encouraged resistance retained influence. Jeremiah pleaded not to be sent back to Jonathan's house. He feared he would die there. Zedekiah granted the request. He ordered Jeremiah transferred to the courtyard of the guard, a confined area associated with the palace complex. A loaf of bread was to be given to him each day from the baker's street for as long as bread remained in the city. That final condition measured the siege more honestly than royal policy did. Jeremiah would receive food, but only until Jerusalem had none left to give. His survival now depended on the same diminishing supply as everyone trapped behind the walls. The Egyptian intervention did not produce lasting relief. Pharaoh's army withdrew, and the Chaldeans returned to Jerusalem. Babylon restored the siege, exactly as Jeremiah had said. The routes closed again. The temporary opening through which Jeremiah had tried to reach Benjamin disappeared. Nebuchadnezzar's forces resumed their positions, and the military pressure entered another stage. Zedekiah had gained an interval, but he had used it neither to surrender nor to correct the covenant violation. The released slaves were again in bondage, Jeremiah was under guard, and Egypt was no longer advancing to save the city. In the 10th year of Zedekiah, which Jeremiah identifies as Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year, the prophet received an instruction that seemed completely at odds with the visible future. His cousin Hanamel would come and ask him to buy a field at Anathoth. The land lay in territory controlled or threatened by the Babylonian army. Jeremiah was confined and had spent years announcing that Judah would be conquered. Buying property there appeared useless. He could not freely travel to inspect or occupy it, and there was no reason to expect the normal security required for agriculture or inheritance. Then Hanamel came to the courtyard of the guard, exactly as Jeremiah had been told. The field at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin belongs within your family's right of redemption, he said. Buy it for yourself. Israelite land law gave a close relative the responsibility or opportunity to redeem family property so that it would not pass permanently out of the clan. Hanamel's request therefore belonged to an established legal process. Under ordinary conditions, Jeremiah's purchase would help preserve the family holding. These were not ordinary conditions. Jeremiah recognized the request as the word of the Lord and bought the field. He weighed out 17 shekels of silver. The price is recorded without explanation, so it is impossible to compare it confidently with a normal market value. What matters is that real money changed hands for real land, while the Babylonian siege made ownership look almost meaningless. The transaction was performed carefully. Jeremiah signed the deed, sealed one copy, obtained witnesses, and weighed the silver on scales. The documentation included both a sealed deed preserving the formal terms and an open copy available for consultation. This was no symbolic performance in which the property existed only in speech. Jeremiah completed a legally recognizable purchase. He handed the deeds to Baruch, son of Neriah, in the presence of Hanamel, the witnesses who had signed, and the Judeans sitting in the courtyard of the guard. Baruch was told to place both documents in an earthenware jar so that they would last a long time. Then Jeremiah gave the reason. Houses, fields, and vineyards would again be bought in the land. The purchase did not contradict his warning about Jerusalem's fall. It established what lay beyond it. Jeremiah could not promise the present owners uninterrupted possession, but he could invest in a future after conquest, because the coming destruction was not the final condition of the land. After giving Baruch the deeds, Jeremiah prayed. He began with God's creation of heaven and earth and the power by which nothing was too difficult. He recalled the Exodus, the gift of the land, and the long history of disobedience that had brought disaster on Jerusalem. Then he described what he could see. Siege ramps had reached the city. Sword, famine, and disease threatened its inhabitants. Babylon was taking possession of Jerusalem, exactly as God had spoken. Yet God had also told him to buy the field and call witnesses when the city was being handed to the Chaldeans. Jeremiah did not conceal the tension. He obeyed first, completed the purchase, and then asked how that action belonged with the judgment already unfolding. The answer began with a question. I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me? Jerusalem would indeed be given to Nebuchadnezzar. The Chaldeans would enter and burn the city, including houses where people had provoked God through idolatrous worship. The judgment was not being withdrawn, and the land purchase would not shield Jeremiah from living through the fall. But the same answer moved beyond destruction. God would gather the people from the lands to which they had been driven and bring them back to dwell in safety. They would be his people, and he would be their God. He would give them one heart and one way, make an enduring covenant with them, and plant them in the land with faithfulness. Fields would again be purchased for silver. Deeds would be signed, sealed, and witnessed in Benjamin, around Jerusalem, throughout Judah, in the hill country, the lowlands, and the southern region. The legal details Jeremiah had just completed under guard anticipated ordinary life restored across the country. The earthenware jar would preserve evidence longer than the institutions around it seemed likely to survive. Zedekiah's throne could fall, the palace could burn, and the current owners could be deported. But the deed declared that the land still had a human future. Jeremiah remained confined in the courtyard. The purchase did not free him, and its promise did not feed the city. Babylon's army stayed outside the walls. Bread continued to diminish. Zedekiah kept seeking private access to the prophet because he feared the answer and could not dismiss it. Each meeting placed the same choice before him: surrender and live, or remain and be handed to Nebuchadnezzar. He listened, protected Jeremiah in limited ways, and then returned to the policy that made the warning inevitable. The officials had less patience. To them, Jeremiah's message weakened soldiers and civilians by telling them resistance would end in defeat. As conditions worsened, they would no longer be satisfied with imprisonment in the courtyard. They would ask the king for permission to kill him. Zedekiah, who still wanted Jeremiah's counsel, would hand him over. The officials named their case against Jeremiah. Shephatiah, son of Matan, Gedaliah, son of Pashur, Jehukal, son of Shelemiah, and Pashur, son of Malchijah, had heard him telling the people that whoever remained in Jerusalem would die, while anyone who surrendered to the Chaldeans would live. They went to Zedekiah and demanded the prophet's death. Jeremiah was weakening the hands of the soldiers and the people, they argued. He was not seeking the welfare of Jerusalem, but its harm. Their accusation judged his words by their military effect. A besieged city depended on defenders believing the walls could hold. Jeremiah was telling those defenders that survival lay with the enemy outside. Whether his prophecy was true mattered less to the officials than the fact that people might act on it. Zedekiah answered, "He is in your hands. The king can do nothing against you." It was an astonishing admission from a reigning monarch. Zedekiah did not sentence Jeremiah himself, but he surrendered him to men whose intention had been plainly stated. The king, who feared Nebuchadnezzar, also feared his own officials. At the moment when decisive authority was most needed, he claimed not to possess it. They took Jeremiah from the courtyard of the guard and lowered him by ropes into a cistern belonging to Malchiah, a member of the royal family. The cistern lay within the guard court. It contained no water, only mud. Jeremiah sank into it. The officials avoided a public execution while placing him where death could come through starvation, exposure, or suffocation in the mire. Food was already disappearing from Jerusalem. A prisoner hidden at the bottom of a cistern could die without another formal decision. Ebed-Melech, a Cushite official serving in the royal palace, heard what had happened. Zedekiah was sitting at the Benjamin Gate, one of the places where a king could conduct public business, and Ebed-Melech left the palace to approach him. "My lord the king," he said, "these men have acted wickedly in all they did to Jeremiah the prophet. He warned that Jeremiah would die from hunger in the cistern because there was no bread left in the city. Ebed-Melech spoke more directly to Zedekiah than many members of the Judean leadership had. He was a foreigner within the court, yet he identified the injustice and placed responsibility before the king, while rescue was still possible. Zedekiah ordered him to take men and pull Jeremiah out before he died. Ebed-Melech went to a storage area beneath the palace treasury and gathered worn garments and old rags. He lowered them by ropes and told Jeremiah to place the cloth beneath his arms so the ropes would not cut into him. Then the men pulled Jeremiah out of the cistern. The detail of the rags gives the rescue its human scale. Ebed-Melech did not simply obey the command to extract a prisoner. He considered how to do it without adding injury. In a city where leaders had reclaimed freed slaves and officials were preparing a prophet's death, a palace servant used discarded cloth to preserve a life. Jeremiah was returned to the courtyard of the guard. A promise also came to Ebed-Melech. When Jerusalem fell, he would not be handed to the men he feared. His life would be given to him as the spoil of war because he had trusted in God. He could not save the city, but his act toward Jeremiah would not be forgotten in its collapse. Zedekiah summoned the prophet one final time. They met secretly near an entrance to the temple. The king said he would ask a question and ordered Jeremiah to hide nothing. Jeremiah hesitated. If he gave the true answer, Zedekiah might kill him. If he offered counsel, the king had shown no willingness to obey. Zedekiah swore privately that he would not kill Jeremiah or hand him back to the men seeking his life. Jeremiah gave the king the same path he had given the people. If Zedekiah surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar's officers, he would live. His household would live, and Jerusalem would not be burned. If he refused, the city would be handed to the Chaldeans and destroyed by fire, and the king would not escape. Zedekiah revealed the fear governing him. He was afraid of the Judeans who had already deserted to Babylon. He believed the Chaldeans might hand him over to them and that they would abuse him. The concern was personal and plausible. Defectors could regard Zedekiah as the ruler who prolonged the siege and exposed their families to famine. The king feared humiliation at the hands of his own people more immediately than the outcome Jeremiah placed before him. "They will not hand you over," Jeremiah said. He urged Zedekiah to obey and promised that his life would be spared. Refusal would produce the very humiliation he feared. The women remaining in the palace would be brought out to Babylonian officers, and they would taunt the king with a song. His trusted friends had deceived and overpowered him. His feet had sunk into the mud. His allies had abandoned him. The image returned the king to Jeremiah's own recent condition. Jeremiah had literally sunk into the mud because Zedekiah yielded to his officials. Now the prophet warned that Zedekiah's political trust would leave him trapped in the same way. His wives and children would be taken to the Chaldeans. He would be captured, and the city would be burned. Zedekiah still did not order surrender. Instead, he told Jeremiah to keep the conversation secret. If the officials asked about the meeting, Jeremiah was to say that he had pleaded not to be returned to Jonathan's house to die there. The officials did question him. Jeremiah gave the answer the king had instructed, and because no one had overheard the conversation, the matter ended. He remained in the courtyard until Jerusalem was taken. The siege continued into Zedekiah's 11th year. By the 9th day of the 4th month, famine had become severe. There was no food for the people of the land. The daily loaf once allotted to Jeremiah could no longer be guaranteed because the condition attached to it had arrived. The city's bread was gone. Then Babylon breached the wall. The accounts do not describe the exact assault that opened it. What mattered was that the barrier on which Jerusalem's strategy depended had failed. Babylonian commanders entered and took positions at the middle gate, converting the interior of the city into occupied ground. Zedekiah and the remaining soldiers fled at night. They escaped through a gate between two walls near the king's garden and headed toward the Arabah, the Great Depression leading toward the Jordan Valley. The route offered a possible path away from the Babylonian lines and into less enclosed terrain. The Chaldean army pursued them. They overtook Zedekiah on the plains near Jericho. His soldiers scattered, leaving the king without the force that had accompanied him from Jerusalem. He was captured and taken north to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah in the land of Hamath. The Babylonian king had established his headquarters there, positioned to direct operations across the western territories. Zedekiah now stood before the ruler whose covenant he had broken. Nebuchadnezzar pronounced judgment. Zedekiah's sons were killed before his eyes. The nobles of Judah were also executed. The deaths removed possible heirs and much of the surviving leadership associated with his rebellion. Then Nebuchadnezzar had Zedekiah blinded. The last thing the Judean king saw was the destruction of his sons and royal line. Afterward, he was bound with bronze shackles and taken to Babylon. Jeremiah and Ezekiel had delivered statements that could once have seemed difficult to reconcile. Jeremiah said Zedekiah would see the king of Babylon and go there. Ezekiel said he would be brought to Babylon but would not see it. At Riblah, both became true. Zedekiah saw Nebuchadnezzar face to face, then entered Babylon blind. Jerusalem remained under military control while Babylon completed its judgment. In the 5th month of Nebuchadnezzar's 19th year, Nebuzaradan, captain of the imperial guard, came to the city. Kings dates his arrival to the 7th day of the month, while Jeremiah gives the 10th, perhaps distinguishing his arrival from the full destruction or preserving a different reckoning. Nebuzaradan burned the temple, the royal palace, and the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building was set on fire. The Chaldean army tore down the walls surrounding the city, removing the fortifications that had supported rebellion. The temple vessels that remained after the earlier deportations were taken. Babylonian soldiers broke apart the bronze pillars, the movable stands and the great bronze sea, and carried the metal to Babylon. They removed pots, shovels, wick trimmers, bowls, dishes, and other implements used in worship. Objects of gold and silver were taken according to their material. The amount of bronze from the temple furnishings could not be weighed. The pillars and basin belonged to the monumental work associated with Solomon's sanctuary. Now they were dismantled as transportable imperial spoil. Nebuzaradan deported many of the people still in the city, including those who had deserted to Babylon and skilled workers who remained. Some of the poorest were left behind to tend vineyards and fields. Babylon did not need Jerusalem empty. It needed the city incapable of renewed resistance and the countryside productive enough to support the administration that followed. Senior religious and civil officials were taken to Riblah. Among them were Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second priest, temple doorkeepers, a military officer, royal counselors, the secretary responsible for mustering troops, and 60 other men found in the city. The accounts differ slightly in the number of royal advisors listed, but they agree on the deliberate removal of those who embodied the remaining leadership. Nebuchadnezzar had them executed at Riblah. Chronicles summarizes the devastation as the exhaustion of patience after repeated warnings had been mocked. The young and old fell, temple treasures were carried away, the sanctuary burned, the wall demolished, and survivors taken into exile. The city Jehoiakim had gambled, Jehoiachin had surrendered, and Zedekiah had sworn to preserve, now lay open and burned. The king of Babylon had not simply replaced another ruler. He had ended the functioning kingdom of Judah. Yet Nebuchadnezzar still needed someone to govern the people left among the ruins and fields. He chose a Judean administrator whose family had protected Jeremiah and supported submission. The next question was whether the survivors could live quietly under that arrangement, or whether Judah would destroy its final refuge with its own hands. For a brief time, the survivors did live quietly under the new arrangement. Nebuchadnezzar appointed Gedaliah son of Ahikam, grandson of Shaphan, over the people left in Judah. His family was already associated with Jeremiah's protection. Ahikam had once defended the prophet from execution, and Gedaliah's appointment offered continuity through a Judean administrator willing to govern under Babylon. Jerusalem could no longer serve as the center of government. Gedaliah established himself at Mizpah, north of the ruined capital. Nebuchadnezzar had also issued instructions concerning Jeremiah. Nebuzaradan was to find him, treat him well, and do whatever the prophet requested. One account describes Babylonian officials taking Jeremiah from the guard court and entrusting him to Gedaliah. Another follows him to Ramah, where he was found bound among captives being assembled for deportation. Together they show Jeremiah passing through the confusion of the conquered city before receiving a clear choice. Nebuzaradan released him from the chains. The Babylonian officer told Jeremiah that the Lord his God had announced disaster against Jerusalem and had now carried it out because the people refused to obey. The words are striking in the mouth of the conqueror's captain. Nebuzaradan understood enough of Jeremiah's public message to recognize that Babylon's victory matched what the prophet had said. He invited Jeremiah to come to Babylon, promising to look after him. If Jeremiah preferred not to go, he was free to remain. The whole land lay before him. Jeremiah chose to stay with the people left in Judah. Nebuzaradan gave him provisions and a gift, and Jeremiah went to Gedaliah at Mizpah. The prophet who had urged surrender did not use Babylonian favor to abandon the remnant once surrender had become unavoidable. Judean military commanders and their men were still scattered through the countryside. When they heard that Gedaliah had been appointed, they came to Mizpah. Among them were Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, Johanan, and Jonathan, sons of Kareah, Seraiah, son of Tanhumeth, and other leaders who had avoided capture. Gedaliah swore that they did not need to fear serving the Chaldeans. "Live in the land and serve the king of Babylon," he told them, "and it will be well with you." He would remain at Mizpah to represent them before Babylonian officials. They were to settle in the towns, gather wine, summer fruit, and oil, and rebuild life from what remained. The opportunity was real. Judeans who had fled to Moab, Ammon, Edom, and other surrounding lands heard that Babylon had left a remnant and placed Gedaliah over it. They returned to Judah and gathered produce in abundance. After siege, famine, fire, execution, and deportation, the land yielded enough for survival. The kingdom was gone, but communities could still form around fields and harvests. Submission under Gedaliah was not independence, yet it preserved the people Jeremiah had stayed to serve. Then Johanan brought Gedaliah a warning. Baalis, king of the Ammonites, had sent Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, to assassinate him. Ishmael belonged to the royal family and had been an officer during Zedekiah's reign. His connection with Ammon suggests that regional politics continued after Jerusalem's fall. A stable Babylonian province under Gedaliah served Nebuchadnezzar's interests. Killing him could destabilize Judah and damage Babylonian control. Gedaliah did not believe the report. Johanan approached him privately and offered to kill Ishmael before Ishmael could act. If Gedaliah died, Johanan argued, the Judeans gathering around him would be scattered and the remnant would perish. Gedaliah forbade it. "You are speaking falsely about Ishmael," he said. His refusal avoided killing a man on an unproven accusation. It also left him exposed to the exact danger Johanan described. In the 7th month, Ishmael came to Mizpah with 10 men. Gedaliah received them at a meal. While they were eating, Ishmael and his companions rose and killed Gedaliah with the sword. They also killed the Judeans with him and the Chaldean soldiers stationed at Mizpah. The assassination destroyed the fragile administration in a single act. Gedaliah had promised that quiet service would allow the remnant to live. Ishmael murdered both Babylon's appointed governor and Babylonian personnel, turning the survivors into a population likely to be treated as rebels, whether they supported him or not. The next day, before the news had spread, 80 men arrived from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria. They had shaved their beards, torn their clothes, and cut themselves in mourning. They carried grain offerings and incense toward the site of the ruined temple. Ishmael went out from Mizpah to meet them, weeping as he approached. He invited them to come and see Gedaliah. Once they entered the town, Ishmael and his men slaughtered them and threw their bodies into a cistern. 10 were spared because they promised hidden stores of wheat, barley, oil, and honey. Ishmael valued the concealed provisions more than completing the massacre. The cistern into which he cast the dead had been built centuries earlier by King Asa during defensive preparations against Baasha of Israel. A structure once associated with protecting the town now received the bodies of pilgrims killed through deception. Ishmael took captive the king's daughters and the rest of the people at Mizpah, whom Nebuzaradan had placed under Gedaliah. He began moving toward Ammon. Johanan and the other commanders heard what had happened and pursued him. They found Ishmael near the great pool at Gibeon. When the captives saw Johanan and his forces, they turned and joined them. Ishmael escaped with 8 men and reached the Ammonites. Johanan had rescued the captives, but he had not restored security. Gedaliah was dead. Babylonian soldiers had been murdered. Ishmael had escaped into the protection of a neighboring kingdom, leaving the recovered survivors to face whatever punishment Nebuchadnezzar imposed. The group moved south and stopped near Bethlehem, intending to enter Egypt. They feared the Chaldeans because Ishmael had killed the governor appointed by the king of Babylon. Before crossing the border, they approached Jeremiah. Johanan, the commanders, and the people from the least to the greatest asked him to pray for them. They described themselves accurately as a small remnant left from a large population. Pray that the Lord your God may show us the way we should go and what we should do. Jeremiah agreed. They promised complete obedience. Whether the answer seemed good or bad, they would follow it. Obedience, they said, would bring them well-being. 10 days later, the answer came. Jeremiah gathered the entire group and told them to remain in Judah. If they stayed, God would build them and not tear them down, plant them and not uproot them. They should not fear Nebuchadnezzar. God would be with them, save them, and cause the Babylonian king to show mercy. But if they entered Egypt because they wanted a place without war, trumpet, or hunger, the dangers they feared would follow them. Sword and famine would reach them there. Those determined to settle in Egypt would die, and none would escape the disaster. Jeremiah told them they had deceived themselves when they asked for guidance. They had promised obedience, but their decision was already made. The response proved him right. Azariah, Johanan, and other defiant men accused Jeremiah of lying. They claimed Baruch, son of Neriah, was inciting him to hand them over to the Chaldeans for death or exile. The same people who had requested a divine answer rejected it when it closed the route they preferred. Their promise to obey, whether good or bad, lasted only until the instruction required them to remain vulnerable in Judah. Johanan and the commanders took the entire remnant into Egypt. They carried the men, women, children, royal daughters, Jeremiah and Baruch across the border. Jeremiah did not choose the flight. The survivors who asked for his counsel forced him to accompany their disobedience. They reached Tahpanhes, an Egyptian center in the eastern Nile Delta. There, near the entrance to Pharaoh's palace, Jeremiah performed another sign. In the sight of the Judeans, he buried large stones beneath the pavement. Nebuchadnezzar would come, Jeremiah said, and place his throne over those stones. He would spread his royal canopy there, strike Egypt, and bring death, captivity, and sword. Egypt's temples and divine images would not prevent him. The king of Babylon would deal with the land and depart. The refugees had crossed into Egypt because they believed the border placed them beyond the punishment attached to Jerusalem. Jeremiah marked the ground beneath an Egyptian royal building as the future platform of Nebuchadnezzar's authority. The conflict continued among Judean communities living at Tahpanhes, Migdol, Memphis, and in southern Egypt. Jeremiah confronted them for worshipping other gods, warning that the same conduct that ruined Jerusalem would reduce the Egyptian remnant further. The people answered that they would continue making offerings to the figure they called the Queen of Heaven. They claimed that when they had done so in Judah, they possessed food and prosperity, and that disaster began when those offerings stopped. The women added that their husbands knew of and participated in the vows. Jeremiah rejected their account of cause and consequence. The disaster came because of persistent idolatry, injustice, and refusal to obey. Their continued worship in Egypt would not recover the lost prosperity of Jerusalem. It would repeat the behavior that destroyed it. He gave them a sign. Pharaoh Hophra would be handed to his enemies, just as Zedekiah had been handed to Nebuchadnezzar. The refuge chosen to escape Babylon was now placed under the same shadow. Internal violence had driven the remnant from Mizpah, fear had carried it across the border, and deliberate refusal had turned a possible life in Judah into another exposure to war. Nebuchadnezzar's reach was no longer measured only by the city he had burned. Tyre still resisted on the coast, and Egypt still presented itself as a great power. The campaigns ahead would show how far Babylon could extend its force, and what even a conqueror gained, or failed to gain, from years of siege. Tyre was harder to reach than Jerusalem. Its power rested on the Mediterranean coast, where trade routes from inland kingdoms met shipping networks extending across the sea. The older settlement included communities on the mainland, but Tyre's strongest position lay on an island just offshore. Water functioned as a defensive wall. An army could devastate surrounding territory and still face a fortified city supplied by ships. The city had also watched Jerusalem's fall with interest. Ezekiel dates his oracle against Tyre to the period surrounding that disaster. Tyre had said of Jerusalem, "Aha, the gate of the peoples is broken. It has swung open to me. I will be filled now that she is laid waste." The language presents more than satisfaction at an enemy's suffering. Jerusalem occupied routes connecting the interior with neighboring regions. Its destruction could redirect trade and influence toward Tyre. The loss of one city appeared to create an opening for another. That calculation placed Tyre inside the same contest Nebuchadnezzar had been settling throughout the West. A wealthy port with strong walls, international connections, and access to sea traffic could not be ignored indefinitely. It might supply hostile coalitions, assist Egypt, shelter fugitives, or refuse the tribute and submission Babylon demanded from the region. Ezekiel announced that many nations would come against Tyre like waves of the sea. The image reaches beyond the action of one army, but within it, Nebuchadnezzar is named directly as the king who would advance from the north. He would come with horses, chariots, cavalry, and a great company of troops. Settlements associated with Tyre on the mainland would fall to the sword. Siege works would rise against the city, ramps, shields, battering engines, and weapons striking its walls. The prophetic description follows the sound and weight of an approaching land army. Dust rises from the horses. The walls shake at the noise of cavalry and wheels. Hooves strike the streets. Pillars fall. Merchandise becomes spoil. Some of those actions fit the accessible mainland more easily than the island stronghold. Nebuchadnezzar could seize roads, fields, wells, villages, and harbors along the coast. He could cut the city off from its normal landward connections. But the final stretch of water protected Tyre from the kind of direct encirclement Babylon had used against Jerusalem. That difference changed the work required of the army. At Jerusalem, Babylon could establish camps around a hill city, construct ramps, pressure gates and walls, and starve the population behind them. Tyre could continue receiving at least some food, information, and material by sea as long as friendly or commercial vessels reached its harbors. A land force therefore needed engineering works, naval cooperation, diplomatic pressure on nearby ports, or enough time to make isolation effective. Nebuchadnezzar committed his army to that time. The surviving sources do not provide a year-by-year Babylonian account of the siege. A Phoenician chronology, preserved by a much later writer, associates Nebuchadnezzar with a 13-year siege of Tyre, and the long duration is consistent with Ezekiel's later description of exhausting labor. The exact opening and closing details are less secure than the length and difficulty of the effort. What can be said confidently is that the campaign was prolonged and costly. Ezekiel envisioned Nebuchadnezzar stripping Tyre of wealth, throwing stones, timber, and soil into the water, and leaving exposed rock where fishermen spread their nets. Centuries later, another conqueror would famously build a causeway to the island with rubble from the mainland city. Ezekiel's language should not be turned into a detailed report of that later operation. In Nebuchadnezzar's story, it conveys the intended reduction of Tyre from a celebrated commercial power to a site emptied of its former abundance. The oracle also gives the city a voice through the reaction of other maritime rulers. Princes of the sea descend from their thrones, remove their robes, and sit trembling on the ground. They lament a renowned city whose strength and inhabitants had spread fear across the waters. Tyre's importance made its danger instructive. Coastal communities that depended on its markets and shipping would feel the shock of any prolonged siege. Merchants could lose access to routes and goods. Allied ports could wonder whether helping Tyre would bring Babylonian pressure against them. Every year, the city remained under assault, forced neighboring powers to decide how much risk they would accept for its survival. Nebuchadnezzar had reasons to persist even when quick victory failed. Leaving Tyre openly resistant after destroying Jerusalem would advertise a limit to Babylon's reach. The city could become a center around which renewed opposition formed. Continuing the siege demonstrated that water and wealth did not remove a kingdom from the imperial demand for submission. Persistence, however, consumed men and resources. Soldiers had to maintain positions far from Babylon. Supplies traveled through territories whose loyalty depended partly on the army's continued presence. Siege equipment required timber, metal, transport animals, and labor. Earthworks had to be built and repaired. Troops exposed to coastal weather and repetitive physical strain still had to remain ready for attack. Ezekiel later condensed that burden into two bodily images. Every head had become bald, and every shoulder had been rubbed bare. The text does not explain the exact tasks producing those marks. They naturally suggest the long abrasion of siege labor, helmets worn through campaigns, loads carried, earth and material moved, and bodies used year after year against a position that would not yield quickly. Nebuchadnezzar was accustomed to campaigns in which victory generated payment. Defeated cities surrendered treasuries, palace wealth, sacred objects, livestock, manufactured goods, and captives. Tribute could support the army that collected it and finance the next campaign. Jerusalem had supplied exactly that kind of visible spoil in more than one deportation. Tyre's wealth was considerable, but wealth housed in an island port could be removed by ship. Merchants could relocate goods before the blockade tightened. Political leaders could negotiate access to maritime allies. Valuable cargo could be dispersed across trading colonies and friendly harbors. Even if Babylon forced Tyre into submission, the city did not necessarily contain the stockpile expected after years of investment. Ezekiel's later oracle states the result plainly. Nebuchadnezzar and his army received no wages from Tyre for the labor they had performed. That does not require the conclusion that the entire campaign failed. The text assumes real service and exhausting effort, but distinguishes political or military achievement from profitable plunder. Other evidence is consistent with Tyre eventually existing within Babylon's sphere of control, though the sources do not preserve a dramatic storming and destruction comparable to Jerusalem. The probable end was therefore less visually complete than the prophetic language of shattered walls and a bare rock might suggest. Tyre's independence was constrained, its mainland holdings suffered, and Babylon's dominance reached the coast. But Nebuchadnezzar did not walk away with spoil equal to the cost of the operation. For the soldiers, that difference was concrete. They had given years of labor to a siege whose expected reward did not materialize. A king could count submission as strategic success. An army understood reward through goods, land, captives, and the distribution that followed victory. For Nebuchadnezzar, Tyre exposed a limit inside conquest itself. He could force a resistant power into a narrower future, but he could not guarantee that the value he pursued would remain waiting for him. The longer he pressed, the more the campaign had to justify the resources already spent. Ezekiel's oracle did not leave the unpaid labor unresolved. In the 27th year of the exile's dating system, the word came that Egypt would be given to Nebuchadnezzar as compensation. The Babylonian king had made his army work hard against Tyre, and Egypt would supply the wages Tyre had not provided. The statement places the campaigns within a sequence of imperial effort. Jerusalem had fallen and yielded people and treasure. Tyre had demanded prolonged labor without comparable spoil. Egypt, the power whose interventions had encouraged Judah and complicated Babylon's control of the West, now became the promised payment. This was more than a search for plunder after disappointment. Egypt had repeatedly stood behind resistance to Nebuchadnezzar. Jehoiakim's rebellion followed a period when Egyptian strength still appeared relevant. Zedekiah sent toward Egypt for horses and troops. Pharaoh's army temporarily pulled Babylon away from Jerusalem. The remnant fled across the border because it treated Egypt as the place Babylon would not reach. As long as Egypt remained outside Nebuchadnezzar's grasp, defeated peoples could continue imagining it as the great alternative. Tyre's coastal resistance and Egyptian power also belonged to the same strategic world. Sea access could connect ports, supplies, envoys, and military expectations. Babylon did not need to annex every mile of territory in identical fashion, but it did need to break the network through which Western kingdoms expected rescue. The oracle assigned Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar as wages because his army had labored in a campaign serving the judgment pronounced against Tyre. From the prophet's viewpoint, the Babylonian king was still operating within an authority he did not control. His desire for compensation and Egypt's approaching defeat could coincide with a purpose neither army had designed. For Nebuchadnezzar, the next target offered a different kind of prestige. Egypt was no small vassal kingdom and no isolated port. It possessed an ancient monarchy, monumental cities, temples, agricultural wealth, and a self-understanding shaped by centuries of continuity. Its king ruled the Nile Valley and claimed the power to protect dependent states beyond it. Carchemish had driven Egypt from the north when Nebuchadnezzar was still crown prince. A campaign into Egypt itself would carry that unfinished rivalry toward its source. Ezekiel described Pharaoh as a great creature, lying among the channels of the Nile and claiming the river as his own creation. The image matched the pride of a ruler whose country depended on the river's abundance and whose political traditions presented kingship as part of the world's sacred order. Nebuchadnezzar had spent his reign confronting rulers who believed their city, temple, alliance, or geography made them secure. Egypt gathered all those forms of confidence into one kingdom. The sources do not permit a sweeping story in which Babylon permanently conquered and occupied the entire Nile Valley. They do establish that Nebuchadnezzar mounted a later campaign against Egypt, and a fragmentary Babylonian text confirms military action there during his reign. The biblical oracles describe the intended breaking of Pharaoh's power and the collapse of Egypt's value as a support for others. The army that left Tyre without adequate wages would now move toward the land Jeremiah's companions had chosen as refuge. Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Jerusalem, endured the coast, and pushed Babylonian force toward the Nile. Yet even as the scale of his dominion expanded, Daniel's final account of the king would return to a quieter setting. Nebuchadnezzar at ease in his own house, flourishing in his palace, troubled again by a dream no conquest could remove. Before that quiet disturbance, Nebuchadnezzar's army carried Babylon's war into Egypt. Ezekiel had described Pharaoh as a great creature stretched among the branches and channels of the Nile. The ruler claimed the river as his own creation, speaking as though Egypt's sustaining order belonged to him. The image suited a kingdom whose life followed the Nile. Its annual waters supported agriculture, transportation, taxation, cities, and temples. Pharaoh stood at the center of that system, and Egypt's long history made its monarchy appear more durable than the kingdoms Babylon had already overturned. Ezekiel's answer was that the creature would be pulled from the river with hooks. The fish, clinging to its scales, would come with it, representing those dependent on Pharaoh's strength. Cast into the open country, it would become food for animals and birds. The prophet also called Egypt a reed staff on which Israel had leaned. A reed could look suitable for support until weight was placed on it. Then it splintered, piercing the shoulder and causing the person holding it to collapse. Judah had experienced that failure more than once. Egypt offered enough encouragement to make resistance plausible, but not enough power to preserve Jerusalem once Nebuchadnezzar returned. Its army interrupted the final siege and then withdrew, leaving Zedekiah with consequences Egypt did not share. Ezekiel announced sword against Egypt from Migdol in the north to Siena near the southern border. Egyptians would be scattered and the land would suffer a period of desolation. Later, a diminished Egypt would continue as a lowly kingdom, but it would no longer rule other nations as it once had. The oracles named Nebuchadnezzar as the agent of the attack. Egypt's wealth would become compensation for the hard service his army had performed. Cities associated with Egyptian strength would fall under pressure, and allies who depended on Pharaoh would discover that his power could not protect them. The language is broader and more complete than the surviving historical record allows us to trace campaign by campaign. Babylon did not permanently absorb the whole Nile Valley as it had absorbed Judah. Egypt retained its own rulers and political identity. A fragmentary Babylonian text nevertheless confirms that Nebuchadnezzar campaigned against Egypt in his 37th year, around 568 or 567 BC. The tablet is too damaged to reconstruct the full operation, but it names Egypt and its ruler Amasis within a Babylonian military record. By then, Pharaoh Hophra, who had sent the force that drew Babylon away from Jerusalem, had lost power in an Egyptian revolt. Amasis took the throne. Hophra later died after an unsuccessful attempt to regain it, fulfilling Jeremiah's warning that he would be handed to his enemies. Though the biblical text does not claim Nebuchadnezzar personally killed him, Nebuchadnezzar's Egyptian campaign demonstrated that the refuge chosen by Judah's remnant was not beyond Babylonian reach. It also marked how far the crown prince of Carchemish had advanced. He had begun by driving Egypt out of the north. Decades later, as king, he carried war into Egypt's own territory. The available evidence does not justify narrating a conquest of every city named in Ezekiel, or claiming that Babylon ruled Egypt for years afterward. What it establishes is enough. Nebuchadnezzar invaded, Pharaoh's claim to regional protection failed, and Egypt could no longer serve as proof that some great power remained untouched by Babylon. After campaigns that had reached from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean and toward the Nile, Nebuchadnezzar was at ease in his house and flourishing in his palace. Daniel preserves the episode in the form of a royal proclamation issued after everything happened. It is addressed to peoples, nations, and languages throughout the earth. But before giving the king's final conclusion, the account returns to the moment when he still appeared secure. Nebuchadnezzar had another dream. This time he remembered it and told it openly. The problem was not recovering hidden content. The problem was finding someone willing and able to explain what the content said about him. The king saw a tree standing at the center of the earth. It grew enormous and strong. Its top reached toward heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it supplied food for all. Animals found shade beneath it. Birds nested in its branches. Every living creature received nourishment from it. The image presented greatness as shelter and provision. This was not a statue made from dead metals and divided into successive kingdoms. It was a living power whose reach supported an entire world beneath it. Then a watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He called out for the tree to be cut down. Its branches were to be lopped off, its leaves stripped and its fruit scattered. The animals would flee from beneath it and the birds from its branches. The command did not require the roots to be destroyed. The stump was to remain in the ground, bound with iron and bronze among the grass of the field. Then the language shifted from a tree to a person. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let the mind of a beast be given to him. Let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence came by decree of the watchers, so that the living would know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men. He gives it to whomever he chooses, and can set over it the lowliest of people. Nebuchadnezzar summoned the wise men of Babylon and told them the dream. They could not make the interpretation known. At last, Daniel entered. The king addressed him by the Babylonian name Belteshazzar and described him according to the king's own understanding as a man in whom was the spirit of the holy gods. Nebuchadnezzar said no mystery was too difficult for him, then repeated the vision and asked for its meaning. Daniel was appalled for a time. His thoughts alarmed him. The king noticed and told him not to let the dream or its interpretation trouble him. "My lord," Daniel answered, "may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies." The words did not flatter Nebuchadnezzar or conceal the judgment. They showed that Daniel could serve the king faithfully without wanting his destruction. He had survived Nebuchadnezzar's court for decades and understood the good and danger contained in a ruler whose decisions affected entire peoples. Daniel began with the tree. The great and strong tree was Nebuchadnezzar. The king had grown powerful, and his greatness reached toward heaven. His dominion extended to the ends of the known earth. The animals and birds sheltered in its branches represented the living world placed under his authority. This confirmed the scale of the reign the king could see around him. Babylon's power collected tribute, protected roots, fed administrators, supported armies, and governed peoples of many languages. Nebuchadnezzar was not imagining that his decisions had vast consequences, but the watcher's command was a sentence against him. The king would be driven away from human society. He would live with the animals of the field, eat grass like an ox, and be wet with the dew of heaven. 7 periods would pass until he learned that the Most High rules human kingdoms and gives them to whomever he chooses. The stump left in the ground meant that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would be preserved for him. His rule could return after he recognized that heaven governs. The band of iron and bronze did not mean the judgment had been cancelled. The tree would still be cut down, yet the roots would survive beneath the field, holding the possibility of restoration after the appointed period. Daniel did more than interpret. He urged the king to respond before the sentence fell. "Let my counsel be acceptable to you," he said. Nebuchadnezzar should break with his sins by practicing righteousness, and with his injustices by showing mercy to the oppressed. Perhaps his prosperity would be prolonged. The council focused on how imperial greatness touched vulnerable people. The tree fed and sheltered creatures in the dream, but Nebuchadnezzar's actual reign also contained forced submission, destruction, executions, and threats issued whenever his authority was challenged. Daniel called him toward justice while time remained. Nothing happened immediately. The king continued in his palace. Days became months, and the warning could begin to feel less urgent. There was no visible watcher, no cut trunk, and no interruption of government. Babylon remained magnificent. 12 months passed. Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. The city below bore unmistakable evidence of his reign. He had undertaken vast building projects, expanding palaces, strengthening fortifications, restoring temples, and creating monumental approaches through the capital. His inscriptions speak repeatedly of construction performed for Babylon and its gods. The famous Ishtar Gate and the processional way belonged to the transformed royal city over which he presided. Ancient Babylon long predated Nebuchadnezzar, and he had not created it from empty ground. Yet the form seen during his reign reflected decades of royal labor, taxation, administration, imported materials, and workers drawn from across the empire. He could point to walls, gates, sanctuaries, and palaces carrying his name. "Is this not great Babylon," he said, "which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" The statement gathered his career into one claim: the victory at Carchemish, the submission of kingdoms, the fall of Jerusalem, the labor at Tyre, the campaign against Egypt, and the construction of Babylon all appeared to lead toward the man standing above the city. The dream had not denied that he was the great tree. Daniel had told him plainly that his power was immense. The warning concerned what he believed that greatness proved and how he used it. After 12 months, Nebuchadnezzar spoke as though Babylon's glory began and ended with himself. The words were still in the king's mouth when a voice came from heaven. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you." The sentence continued before anyone on earth could answer it. Nebuchadnezzar would be driven away from human society. His dwelling would be with the animals of the field. He would eat grass like an ox and be wet with the dew of heaven. 7 periods would pass over him until he learned that the Most High rules human kingdoms and gives them to whomever he chooses. The judgment was fulfilled immediately. The king who had stood above Babylon was removed from human company. The text does not identify the officials who took control of him, describe a palace struggle, or explain where he lived during the interval. It gives only the condition Daniel had announced. Nebuchadnezzar ceased to function within ordinary human society and lived exposed among the creatures of the field. He ate vegetation like an ox. His body was wet with the dew. His hair grew until it resembled eagle's feathers, and his nails became like birds' claws. Those images describe prolonged neglect, exposure, and the loss of the habits by which a king appeared before other people. Court dress, attendance, controlled spaces, prepared meals, and public ceremony disappeared. The man whose decrees had regulated the bodies of others no longer maintained his own. Attempts have been made to assign Nebuchadnezzar a modern psychiatric diagnosis, sometimes using terms associated with delusions of becoming an animal. Daniel does not provide enough clinical information for that, nor do surviving Babylonian inscriptions mention the episode. Royal inscriptions normally celebrate construction, devotion, victory, and legitimate rule. They are not candid medical records. The biblical account presents the king's condition for a particular reason. His human understanding was taken until he recognized the source of his authority. The phrase 7 periods is also left undefined. It is often understood as 7 years, but Daniel calls them times rather than giving a calendar notation. Their narrative purpose is clear, even where the precise duration is not. Nebuchadnezzar could not end the condition by issuing another decree. It would continue through the full period appointed for him. Nothing in the sentence suggested that Babylon itself ceased to function. The dream had preserved the stump and roots of the tree, bound with iron and bronze. Administration continued somehow, and the kingdom remained capable of receiving him again. Daniel does not identify a regent or describe the arrangements that protected the throne. Inventing that missing court history would make the story more detailed than its sources allow. The silence around the palace shifts attention to Nebuchadnezzar himself. He had once demanded that Babylon's advisors enter the hidden contents of his dream. He had ordered an entire learned class killed when they could not. He had built an image and required officials to bow at the sound of music. He had asked what god could rescue condemned men from his hand. He had subdued kings, taken their wealth, renamed their successors, and punished broken oaths. Now no command shortened his appointed time. The imperial tree had been cut to a stump, and its surviving root did not lie within his control. His kingdom could be preserved without his participation. The city he called his own continued beyond his reach, while he shared the field with animals that neither knew nor acknowledged his titles. At the end of the appointed period, Nebuchadnezzar lifted his eyes toward heaven. His reason returned to him. The order is central to the king's own account. He did not first recover, inspect his restored circumstances, and then decide that gratitude was appropriate. His recognition and his return to understanding belonged to the same movement. The ruler who had looked across Babylon and credited himself now looked above himself. He blessed the Most High and praised the one who lives forever. Nebuchadnezzar said that God's dominion is everlasting and his kingdom continues from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing beside his authority. He acts according to his will among the host of heaven and among those who live on earth. No one can restrain his hand or demand an account from him. The words answered the boast from the palace roof. Nebuchadnezzar's great city had been built during one reign. God's dominion did not begin with an accession or wait for military victory. Babylon's king could be resisted by Tyre, distracted by Egypt, and removed from his own court. The rule he now acknowledged faced no comparable limit. At the same time that his reason returned, Nebuchadnezzar's royal honor and splendor returned. His counselors and nobles sought him out. The phrase suggests that restoration became public and administrative, not simply inward. The officials who could recognize and re-establish the king came to him, and he was restored to his kingdom. Even greater majesty was added to him. Daniel does not describe another coronation, a struggle against a rival, or terms imposed by the nobles. The restoration is stated with the same directness as the removal. Nebuchadnezzar had been driven from humanity. Now human society received him. He had lost the practical exercise of kingship. Now his court sought him, and his throne was confirmed. The man who returned was still Nebuchadnezzar. The account does not say that he dismantled Babylon's empire, returned every conquered people to its land, or ceased to rule as an ancient monarch. Jerusalem remained destroyed. Zedekiah remained blinded. The exiles did not suddenly go home. Recognition of heaven did not reverse every consequence of the king's campaigns. What changed was the conclusion Nebuchadnezzar drew from his own greatness. Earlier, after Daniel revealed the statue dream, he honored the God who disclosed mysteries. After the furnace, he praised the God who rescued faithful servants. Those encounters showed him powers his court and sentence could not contain. This final event concerned the source and limits of Nebuchadnezzar's own authority. He was not watching another person receive revelation or deliverance. He was the tree cut down. He therefore made his humiliation part of a royal proclamation. Nebuchadnezzar addressed all peoples, nations, and languages dwelling throughout the earth and wished them peace. He said it seemed good to him to declare the signs and wonders the Most High God had performed for him. For him now included both judgment and restoration. The loss of his reason was not described as an embarrassing interruption concealed behind palace walls. It became the event through which he learned what conquest, architecture, and imperial reach had not taught him. He called the signs great, and the wonders mighty, because they had reached the king, where armies could not. The proclamation then recounted the dream, Daniel's interpretation, the year of delay, the boast, the heavenly sentence, the period among the animals, and the return of understanding. Its form makes Nebuchadnezzar the public witness against his former certainty. Ancient royal declarations usually established why a king deserved obedience, how the gods favored him, what enemies he defeated, and what monuments he built. Daniel's Nebuchadnezzar announced that heaven removed him when he took his majesty as self-created. His restored position did not erase that confession. It gave him the standing from which to publish it. He concluded, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven. All God's works were truth," he said, "and his ways justice. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." The last sentence did not come from Daniel standing before the throne or Jeremiah speaking against an empire. It came from the king, whose name had represented Babylonian power throughout their lives. Nebuchadnezzar knew what the word able meant by then. He had once declared that Daniel's companions served a God able to rescue, but he had still treated his own rule as the fixed point from which power was measured. Now he spoke as the man who had been unable to preserve his mind, status, or place among other people. The title King of Heaven also relocated Nebuchadnezzar within the order he governed. He remained king of Babylon, but he was not the highest king in his own testimony. The dominion above him could grant power, interrupt it, preserve it as a stump, and return it after recognition. That is where Daniel leaves his personal story. Secure Babylonian records show that Nebuchadnezzar continued to be remembered as the great builder of the Neo-Babylonian capital. Inscriptions across Babylon associated his name with walls, gates, temples, palaces, canals, and restoration projects. Later generations could still see the material reach of his reign, even when the political order supporting it had vanished. He ruled for approximately 43 years, an unusually long reign for the dynasty he established. He had begun as the crown prince who defeated Egypt at Carchemish and hurried home to secure his father's throne. He died in 562 BC after decades in which Babylon became the dominant imperial power of the region. His empire outlived him, but his dynasty did not enjoy his stability for long. Nebuchadnezzar's son, Amel-Marduk, called Evil Merodach in Kings and Jeremiah, succeeded him. In the accession year of the new king, another prisoner's circumstances changed. Jehoiachin of Judah had been in Babylon for 37 years. He had surrendered Jerusalem as an 18-year-old king and entered captivity with his mother, wives, officials, and leading citizens. Zedekiah had replaced him, rebelled, lost his sons and sight, and been brought to the same imperial capital in chains. Jerusalem had burned, while Jehoiachin remained alive in confinement. Amel-Marduk released him from prison. Kings places the act on the 27th day of the 12th month, while Jeremiah gives the 25th, preserving a small difference in the dating of the same royal favor. The new Babylonian king spoke kindly to Jehoiachin and gave him a seat above the other captive kings in Babylon. Jehoiachin changed out of his prison clothes. For the rest of his life, he ate regularly at the king's table and received a daily allowance from the palace. Babylon still held him, and Judah's throne was not restored. Yet Nebuchadnezzar, who had conquered Jerusalem and carried its young king away, was gone. The captive line endured beyond the conqueror. The final image is quiet. Jehoiachin, no longer dressed as a prisoner, seated before Nebuchadnezzar's successor, receiving bread one day at a time.